What if I told you that humans have been getting high for at least 500 years, and the first people to do it weren't hippies at parties or jazz musicians in smoky basements, but priests conducting funeral rites in the mountains of Central Asia? Here's a fact that will blow your mind. According to archaeological evidence published in Science Advances, researchers found ancient wooden braziers in the Pamir Mountains that still contained burnt cannabis residue with elevated levels of psychoactive THC deliberately used in religious ceremonies around 500 BCE. These weren't accidental fires or hemp rope burning. This was intentional, ritualistic inhalation of cannabis smoke, complete with specially selected high-potency plants. If that just made you think, wait, ancient people were hotboxing funerals? Then you're absolutely right. And here's the kicker. This practice was so widespread, so embedded in human culture across continents, that by the time Western governments tried to ban it in the 20th century, they were fighting against thousands of years of human tradition. You're going to absolutely love how this story unfolds, because it turns out the war on weed was never really about the plant. It was about control, race, and money. And spoiler alert, the plant is winning. Hey friends, tonight we'll walk right through the heart of one of humanity's oldest relationships, one that crosses continents, cultures, and millennia, and somehow still manages to be controversial. Before you get comfortable, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here's where this gets interesting. For most of modern history, we've been told that smoking weed is a recent phenomenon, something that emerged from counterculture movements, or maybe ancient India at best. But the truth, humans have been deliberately inhaling cannabis smoke for thousands of years, from the frozen peaks of the Pamirs to the temples of ancient China, from Scythian burial mounds to medieval Arabic bathhouses. This isn't a story about when people discovered getting high. It's about when we forgot, and why some very powerful people wanted to keep it that way. Let's start at the very beginning, back when the first humans looked at a strange, sticky plant and thought, you know what? Let's set this on fire and see what happens. When did humans first start smoking weed? All right, here's where things get interesting, because pinpointing exactly when humans first started smoking cannabis is like trying to figure out who invented bread. The practice is so old, so widespread, and so deeply woven into early human culture that it predates written records in most places. But thanks to modern archaeology, chemistry, and a lot of very patient scientists sifting through ancient ash, we're finally getting some answers. And those answers? They're older and weirder than most people expect. Let's talk about the earliest confirmed evidence. In 2019, a team of researchers published a groundbreaking study in Science Advances that changed everything we thought we knew about ancient cannabis use. They'd been excavating a cemetery in the Pamir Mountains, specifically at a site called Jirzangkal in what's now Western China, dating back roughly 2,500 years. Now, the Pamirs aren't just any mountains. They're some of the highest, most remote peaks in Central Asia, sitting at the crossroads of ancient trade routes that would later become part of the Silk Road. And in several tombs at this site, archaeologists found wooden braziers basically ancient incense burners that still contained the charred remains of cannabis plants. Here's where it gets wild. The researchers didn't just find burnt plant material. They used a technique called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which sounds like something from a sci-fi movie, but is basically a super precise way to identify chemical compounds in old samples. And what they found was cannabis with elevated levels of THC, the psychoactive compound that gets you high. Not hemp, not low-potency industrial fiber plants. This was the good stuff, deliberately selected for its mind-altering properties and burned in what appears to have been a religious or funerary ritual. Now, you might think, okay, so some ancient people got high at funerals. Weird, but not that shocking. But here's the thing. This wasn't a one-off experiment. The practice was consistent across multiple burials, suggesting it was an established tradition, not just someone's wild idea one afternoon. And the location matters too. The Pamir Mountains sit right at the intersection of Central Asia, where ancient cultures from China, India, Persia, and the steppes all mingled and traded ideas, technologies, and yes, plants. This was a cultural crossroads, and cannabis was right there in the middle of it. According to the study's lead author, this discovery represents the oldest clear evidence of cannabis being used specifically for its psychoactive effects. Not for rope, not for seeds, not for oil, but to alter consciousness. And that raises a fascinating question. Why? What were these ancient people trying to achieve by inhaling cannabis smoke during funerals? Picture this. You're a member of a small community living in the harsh, thin air of the Pamir Highlands 2,500 years ago. Life is brutal. Winters are deadly. Your worldview is shaped by spirits, ancestors, and the ever-present sense that the dead are still somehow with you, watching, influencing, and demanding respect. Now, someone in your community dies. This isn't just a loss. It's a cosmic event that requires mediation between the living and the dead, and to bridge that gap, to communicate with the other side, or to honor the departed in a way that transcends ordinary experience. You burn a plant that you know, from long tradition, opens the mind and loosens the boundaries of perception. The smoke rises, the mourners inhale, and for a moment, the veil between worlds feels just a little thinner. That's not speculation. That's what the archaeological context suggests. The braziers were found in tombs, often alongside musical instruments, and the bodies were arranged in ways that indicate ceremony, not casual disposal. This was ritual, and cannabis was the key. But here's the kicker. The Pamir discovery isn't the only evidence we have. It's just the oldest confirmed case with chemical proof. There are hints, strong hints, that cannabis smoking goes back even further. In the 1990s, archaeologists working in the Yanghai tombs in northwestern China, dating to around 700 BCE, found nearly 2 pounds of cannabis buried with a light-haired, blue-eyed shaman. The plant material was well preserved, and analysis showed it was high in THC and appeared to have been prepared for consumption, possibly by burning. The burial context, the individual's role as a shaman, and the careful placement of the cannabis all point to its use in spiritual or medicinal practices. And then there are the Scythians. If you've ever heard of ancient stoners, the Scythians are the OGs. These were nomadic warrior tribes who roamed the Eurasian steppes from roughly the 9th century BCE to the 4th century CE. They were feared, respected, and according to the Greek historian Herodotus, absolutely loved getting high. Writing in the 5th century BCE, Herodotus described how the Scythians would set up small tents, throw cannabis seeds onto red-hot stones, and then sit inside, inhaling the smoke until they howled with pleasure. Now, Herodotus was writing about seeds, not flour, so there's some debate about how effective that actually was. But modern analysis of Scythian burial mounds has turned up actual evidence: bronze and gold censers, leather pouches containing cannabis seeds and residue, and even wooden poles that might have supported vapor tents, exactly like the ones Herodotus described. So to recap, by 500 BCE, we have hard chemical evidence of psychoactive cannabis use in the Pamirs. By 700 BCE, we have cannabis buried with shamans in China and scattered across the steppes from the Black Sea to Mongolia. We have a warrior culture that turned hot boxing into an art form. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was widespread, deliberate, and deeply embedded in ritual life. Now, does that mean humans started smoking weed exactly 2,500 years ago? Almost certainly not. What it means is that by that point, the practice was already so established, so refined, that people were selectively breeding high-potency plants and incorporating them into major cultural ceremonies. You don't just wake up one day and decide to breed psychoactive cannabis for funerals. That takes generations of knowledge, experimentation, and tradition, which means the real origin point is probably much older, maybe thousands of years older, lost somewhere in the unrecorded past when early humans first encountered wild cannabis and noticed that burning it did something interesting to the mind. And here's what really makes you think. Cannabis is native to Central Asia. It grows wild across the steppes and mountain foothills, thriving in the same regions where early nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples lived, hunted, and eventually settled. It's not hard to imagine a scenario where, long before 2,500 years ago, someone tossed a cannabis plant onto a fire, either by accident or curiosity, and noticed that the smoke made people feel different, relaxed, euphoric, contemplative, maybe a little giggly, and from that moment, the knowledge spread, person to person, tribe to tribe, carried along trade routes and migration paths until it reached every corner of the ancient world. But the story doesn't stop there, because once humans figured out that cannabis could alter consciousness, the next question was obvious. Why would you want to do that? What purpose did it serve? Was it just for fun, or was there something deeper, something spiritual or medicinal driving this ancient obsession with getting high? And that's not even the weirdest part, because part 2, it gets stranger. Let's dive into this, because now that we know humans were deliberately smoking high-potency cannabis at least 2,500 years ago, we need to ask the obvious question: how did they figure this out? And more importantly, how did they go from stumbling across wild cannabis to selectively breeding specific strains for maximum psychoactive effect? Here's where it gets interesting. Cannabis isn't just one plant. It's a species with incredible genetic diversity, and depending on where it grows and how it's cultivated, it can produce wildly different chemical profiles. Some varieties are packed with THC, the compound that gets you high. Others are high in CBD, which doesn't produce a psychoactive effect, but has medicinal properties. And then there's hemp, which is basically cannabis, bred for fiber and seeds, with almost no THC at all. For most of human history, people use all of these varieties for different purposes. But the fact that ancient people in the Pamirs were burning high THC cannabis specifically tells us something crucial. They knew the difference. They could identify which plants produced the desired effect, and they cultivated them accordingly. So how did they do it? According to botanists and archaeologists who study ancient agriculture, it probably started with observation. Wild cannabis grows across Central Asia, and it naturally varies in potency depending on environmental conditions. Plants growing at higher altitudes or in harsher climates tend to produce more resin, which contains higher concentrations of cannabinoids as a defense mechanism against UV radiation and temperature stress. Early humans living in these regions would have noticed that certain plants, when burned, produced stronger effects than others. And once you notice that, the next step is obvious. Save the seeds from the good plants, cultivate them, and repeat the process over generations. It's the same basic technique humans use to domesticate wheat, dogs, and every other useful organism we've ever worked with. But here's the thing. Selective breeding takes time. You don't just plant a few seeds, and boom, you've got ancient Kush. You need generations of cultivation, careful observation, and probably a lot of trial and error, which means the people burning high-potency cannabis in the Pamir tombs in 500 BCE were standing on the shoulders of centuries, maybe millennia, of accumulated botanical knowledge. Their ancestors had been working with this plant for a very long time, and it wasn't just happening in the Pamirs. Similar patterns show up across ancient Eurasia. In the Altai Mountains of Siberia, archaeologists have found frozen Scythian tombs, preserved by permafrost, containing leather bags filled with cannabis seeds and what appears to be dried flour. In one famous burial, known as the Pazyryk tombs, dating to around 400 BCE, researchers discovered elaborate bronze sensors designed specifically for burning plant material. Along with pouches of cannabis, the individuals buried there were clearly high status, possibly shamans or tribal leaders, and cannabis was considered important enough to accompany them into the afterlife. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but how do we know they were actually smoking it? Maybe they just liked the smell. Fair question, and the answer is context. The braziers and censers found in these sites aren't designed like modern incense burners, where you're trying to gently perfume a room. They're designed to produce a lot of smoke in a confined space, often with lids or covers that would trap the smoke and force people to lean in and inhale. The Scythian vapor tents Herodotus described, those weren't ventilated. They were hot boxes, medieval style, and the chemical residue found in some of these braziers shows clear signs of combustion at temperatures consistent with smoking, not just passive exposure. So, yes, they were smoking it, or at least they were inhaling concentrated cannabis smoke in a way that would absolutely get them high, and they were doing it on purpose as part of organized rituals, not just for fun on a Friday night. But here's where the story gets even more layered, because while we have solid evidence for ritualistic cannabis smoking in Central Asia by 500 BCE, there are tantalizing hints that the practice might be even older and might have spread through different channels. We're only beginning to understand. Let's talk about China. Ancient Chinese texts, particularly medical and botanical records, mention cannabis going back thousands of years. The legendary emperor Shen Nong, often called the father of Chinese medicine and dated to around 2800 BCE, though he's probably a mythical composite figure, is credited in later texts with cataloging hundreds of medicinal plants, including cannabis. Now, these texts weren't written until much later, so we can't take them as literal historical records, but they reflect a long-standing tradition of cannabis use in Chinese culture, particularly for medicinal and possibly spiritual purposes. The earliest written reference to cannabis in China comes from texts dating to around 100 BCE, where it's listed as one of the fundamental herbs in traditional medicine. But the plant itself was clearly being used long before that. Archaeological evidence shows cannabis fibers being used for textiles and rope in China as far back as 4000 BCE, which means people were cultivating the plant and intimately familiar with it for millennia before anyone thought to write about smoking it. And here's where things get speculative, but fascinating. Some researchers believe that cannabis use, including psychoactive use, might have been part of early shamanic practices in China, particularly among the peoples living on the northern and western frontiers, where Chinese culture blended with the nomadic steppe cultures we've been talking about. The Yanghai shaman, buried with cannabis in 700 BCE, he was found in Xinjiang, right on that cultural boundary. It's entirely possible that psychoactive cannabis use flowed back and forth across these regions for centuries, maybe millennia, carried by traders, shamans, and migrants long before anyone wrote it down. Now let's talk about India, because no discussion of ancient cannabis use is complete without it. In Hindu tradition, cannabis, particularly in the form of bhang, a drink made from cannabis leaves, is closely associated with the god Shiva. According to mythology, Shiva discovered cannabis after a family argument and found that consuming it brought him peace and insight. Whether or not you buy the divine origin story, the point is clear. Cannabis has been part of Indian religious and cultural life for an extremely long time. The Vedas, ancient Hindu texts dating back to around 1500 BCE, mention a plant called bhang, or soma, that scholars have debated for over a century. Some argue soma was a different plant entirely, possibly a psychedelic mushroom, or a type of ephedra. But bhang is pretty clearly cannabis, and it shows up in later Vedic texts as one of the 5 sacred plants, referred to as a source of happiness, a liberator, and something that brings joy. By the time of the Atharva Veda, written sometime between 1200 and 1000 BCE, cannabis is explicitly mentioned as a medicinal and ritual plant. So by 1000 BCE at the latest, we have cannabis embedded in Indian religious practice. And given how long it takes for a plant to become sacred, for rituals to develop around it, and for an entire theological framework to incorporate it, Shiva's association with cannabis isn't a footnote, it's a major element of his mythology. We're probably looking at a tradition that goes back much further, possibly into the 2nd millennium BCE or earlier. And here's the wild part. All of these regions, Central Asia, Northern China, the Indian subcontinent, the Eurasian steppes, they're not isolated, they're connected by trade routes, migration patterns, and cultural exchange going back thousands of years. Cannabis, as a plant, is native to this entire zone. It grows wild, from the Hindu Kush to the Altai Mountains, from the Tibetan Plateau to the shores of the Caspian Sea. Early human populations in this region didn't have to discover cannabis. They grew up with it. It was part of their landscape, their medicine cabinet, their textile industry, and eventually, their spiritual toolkit. So, when did humans first start smoking weed? Honestly, we don't know the exact date, but based on the evidence we have, it's safe to say that by 2,500 years ago, the practice was already ancient, widespread, and sophisticated. The people burning cannabis in the Pamir tombs weren't inventing anything new. They were participating in a tradition that stretched back centuries, maybe millennia, carried forward by shamans, healers, warriors, and priests who understood that this strange, sticky plant had the power to alter consciousness, ease suffering, and bridge the gap between the human and the divine. And honestly, that's beautiful, because it means that for as long as humans have been building civilizations, exploring the world, and trying to make sense of existence, cannabis has been right there with us, not as a drug, not as a crime, but as a plant, a tool, a sacrament. And the story of how that relationship evolved, how it spread across the world, and how it eventually became one of the most controversial substances on the planet. That's where things really get interesting. Why did ancient people smoke weed? So, where do we begin? We've established that humans have been smoking cannabis for at least 2,500 years, probably much longer. But knowing when people did something is only half the story. The real question, the one that gets to the heart of why this plant has followed humanity across continents and millennia, is why. Why did ancient people go to the trouble of cultivating, harvesting, and burning this particular plant? What were they trying to accomplish? And why did the practice spread so widely, so quickly, that by the time written history begins, cannabis was already embedded in cultures from China to the Mediterranean? Here's the thing. Ancient people didn't do things for no reason. Every ritual, every plant, every tradition had a purpose, whether practical, spiritual, or social. And when it comes to cannabis, the purposes were actually remarkably diverse. It wasn't just one thing. It was medicine. It was religion. It was social bonding. It was a tool for altered states of consciousness that allowed people to communicate with gods, ancestors, or just their own deeper selves. And in some cases, yeah, it was probably just because it felt good, and life was hard enough already without denying yourself a little relief. Let's talk about the spiritual angle first, because that's where the oldest and most consistent evidence points. In almost every ancient culture where we find evidence of cannabis use, it shows up in religious or ritual contexts. The Pamir tombs we talked about, those weren't recreational smoke sessions. They were funerals. The Scythian vapor tents, part of purification rituals and possibly communal ceremonies. The Indian sadhus who've been smoking cannabis for millennia, they do it as an offering to Shiva and as a way to facilitate meditation and transcendence. Even in ancient China, where cannabis was primarily used for medicine and textiles, there are hints that Taoist and shamanic practitioners used it in ceremonies designed to commune with spirits or achieve altered states. Now, you might think, okay, so ancient people got high for religious reasons. But why? What's the connection between cannabis and spirituality? And here's where it gets fascinating. Because in the ancient world, the line between the physical and the spiritual wasn't as clear-cut as it is today. Illness, for example, wasn't just a biological problem. It was often seen as a spiritual imbalance, a curse, or the result of offending a deity. Similarly, major life events, births, deaths, marriages, and harvests, weren't just social occasions, they were cosmic moments that required mediation between the human world and the divine. And cannabis, with its unique ability to alter perception, ease anxiety, and create a sense of expanded awareness, was the perfect tool for that meditation. When you inhale cannabis smoke, especially in a ritualistic setting with chanting, music, and communal focus, something happens. Time stretches, ordinary boundaries soften. You become more receptive to symbolism, more open to emotional and sensory experiences, and more willing to entertain ideas that your rational, everyday mind would normally dismiss. In other words, it creates the conditions for what anthropologists call a liminal state, a threshold experience where you're temporarily outside normal reality and more attuned to whatever your culture defines as sacred. For the ancient peoples of Central Asia, that might mean feeling the presence of ancestors during a funeral. For the Scythians, it might mean purifying the soul after battle or preparing for a journey into enemy territory. For Indian mystics, it meant dissolving the ego and experiencing unity with the divine. The specific beliefs varied, but the underlying logic was the same. Cannabis opened a door, and on the other side of that door was something worth experiencing, something you couldn't reach through ordinary consciousness alone. But here's the kicker. It wasn't just about mystical experiences. Cannabis also had very practical, very down-to-earth uses that made it indispensable to ancient societies. And the most important of those? Medicine. Let's be clear about something. Ancient people weren't stupid. They didn't have our scientific tools, but they had something just as valuable. Generations of trial and error experimentation passed down through oral tradition. They knew which plants treated fevers, which ones stopped bleeding, which ones eased pain, and which ones made you see things that weren't there. And cannabis, with its wide range of active compounds, turned out to be remarkably effective for a lot of common ailments. According to ancient Chinese medical texts, cannabis was used to treat everything from malaria and rheumatism to absent-mindedness and menstrual cramps. The legendary physician Hua Tuo, who lived around 200 CE, is said to have used a cannabis-based anesthetic during surgeries, mixing it with wine to create a sedative strong enough to allow him to perform abdominal operations. Now, whether or not Hua Tuo actually existed as a single historical figure is debated, but the fact that these stories were told and that cannabis anesthesia was described in medical texts tells us that people understood its pain-relieving properties and used them clinically. In India, bhang wasn't just a religious sacrament. It was also prescribed for a staggering range of conditions: digestive issues, insomnia, epilepsy, headaches, and even leprosy. Ancient Ayurvedic texts describe cannabis as a remedy that balances the body's doshas, the fundamental energies that govern health, and can treat both physical and mental disorders. And unlike some ancient remedies, which ranged from useless to actively harmful, looking at you, mercury treatments, cannabis actually works. Modern research has confirmed that cannabinoids have legitimate analgesic, anti-inflammatory, anti-anxiety, and anticonvulsant properties. Ancient doctors didn't know why it worked, but they knew that it worked, and they used it accordingly. In the Middle East and Mediterranean, cannabis use was less about smoking and more about topical applications and ingestion, but the medicinal logic was the same. Greek and Roman physicians, influenced by earlier Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions prescribed cannabis for earaches, inflammation, and even childbirth pain. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing in the 1st century CE, described cannabis in his De Materia Medica, a foundational pharmacological text that remained in use for over 1,500 years. He noted that cannabis seeds could be used to suppress sexual desire, which, given Roman attitudes toward self-control, was considered a therapeutic benefit, and that the plant itself could treat a variety of ailments. So to recap, cannabis wasn't just a spiritual tool or a recreational indulgence. It was a legitimate, widely recognized medicine that ancient people used to manage pain, reduce inflammation, treat chronic conditions, and even perform surgery. And because medicine and religion weren't separate domains in the ancient world, the same plant could serve both functions simultaneously. A shaman might burn cannabis to commune with spirits and to ease the pain of a dying community member. An Indian sadhu might smoke it as an offering to Shiva and to treat his chronic arthritis. The categories we use today, spiritual versus medicinal, didn't really apply. But there's another reason ancient people smoked cannabis, one that's less talked about, but probably just as important: social bonding. Think about it. In small, tight-knit communities, where survival depended on cooperation, anything that brought people together, that created shared experiences and mutual trust, was valuable. And cannabis, when used in a communal setting, does exactly that. It lowers social inhibitions, encourages laughter and conversation, and creates a sense of camaraderie. The Scythian vapor tents weren't just religious rituals. They were bonding experiences, moments when warriors could relax, share stories, and strengthen the social ties that held their tribes together. This social dimension shows up across cultures. In ancient India, bhang was, and still is, consumed during festivals like Holi, where the whole community comes together to celebrate, play, and temporarily dissolve social hierarchies. In Central Asia, cannabis smoking likely played a role in trade negotiations and diplomatic meetings, where establishing trust and goodwill was essential. Even the act of passing a pipe or sharing smoke has a ritualistic quality that signals inclusion, reciprocity, and mutual respect. And let's not ignore the obvious. Sometimes, people smoked cannabis just because it felt good. Life in the ancient world was brutal. Infant mortality was high. Famines were common. Wars were frequent. Medical care was limited. And the constant physical labor required to survive, farming, herding, building, hauling, took a toll on the body. In that context, having access to a plant that eased pain, reduced anxiety, and provided a few hours of relief from the grinding hardships of daily life, that's not indulgence. That's survival. But here's what really gets me. The ancient world didn't see pleasure and purpose as opposites. For them, something could be enjoyable and sacred, recreational and medicinal, fun and meaningful. Cannabis embodied that synthesis perfectly. It was a gift from the gods, a tool of the healer, a bond between friends, and yeah, sometimes just a way to make a long winter evening pass a little more pleasantly. And there's no contradiction in that. It's only our modern categories, drug versus medicine, sacred versus profane, that make it seem like there should be. So, why did ancient people smoke weed? The answer is, for all the reasons humans do anything. Because it worked. Because it mattered. because it connected them to something larger than themselves, and because sometimes, in a world that was often cold, harsh, and short, a little smoke rising into the sky was enough to make life feel just a bit more bearable. And that's not even the weirdest part, because part two, it gets even more interesting. Alright, here's where things get really interesting. We've talked about the spiritual uses, the medicinal applications, and the social bonding aspects of cannabis in the ancient world. But there's another dimension to this story that often gets overlooked, and it's crucial for understanding why cannabis became so deeply embedded in so many cultures: economics and trade. Let's talk about something that might surprise you. Cannabis wasn't just a sacred plant or a medicine cabinet staple. It was also a cash crop, or rather, the ancient equivalent of one. The plant is incredibly versatile. The fibers can be woven into rope, textiles, and paper. The seeds are nutritious and can be pressed for oil. The leaves and flowers have medicinal and psychoactive properties, and it grows fast, tolerates poor soil, and doesn't require intensive cultivation. In pre-industrial societies, where every resource had to be maximized and nothing could be wasted, cannabis was a godsend. According to archaeological evidence, cannabis fiber was being used in China as early as 4000 BCE for making textiles and rope. By the time of the Han Dynasty, around 200 BCE to 200 CE, cannabis paper was becoming common, and the plant was cultivated on a massive scale. But here's the thing: when you're growing cannabis for fiber, you're typically growing low THC varieties, what we'd call hemp today. But when you're growing it for seeds, you end up with plants that might have higher cannabinoid content, especially if you're not harvesting the flowers and they're allowed to mature fully. And in regions where cannabis grew wild or semi-wild, people had access to both types: the practical, workhorse hemp, and the potent, psychoactive varieties. This created an interesting dynamic. Cannabis became valuable on multiple levels simultaneously. A farmer might grow it primarily for fiber or seed oil, but if a traveling shaman or merchant offered to trade for the flowering tops, well, that's extra income. A community might use the plant for rope and clothing, but reserve the resinous flowers for religious ceremonies or medicine. The same field, the same plant, serving multiple purposes. And that economic versatility is part of why cannabis spread so widely and so quickly across the ancient world. Now, let's talk about the Silk Road, because this is where the story really takes off. The Silk Road wasn't just one road. It was a vast network of trade routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually the Mediterranean, operating roughly from 200 BCE to 1400 CE at its peak. And along these routes traveled silk, spices, precious metals, art, ideas, religions, and yes, cannabis. Picture this: you're a merchant in the 3rd century BCE, traveling from northern China toward Central Asia. You're carrying silk, jade, maybe some lacquerware. Along the way, you pass through regions where cannabis grows wild and is cultivated by local people. You notice that these people use it for everything: rope, clothing, food, medicine, and religious rituals. You learn that certain varieties produce a resin that can be collected and burned or eaten for medicinal and spiritual purposes. And you realize that back home or further west along your route, there are buyers who would pay good money for this knowledge, these seeds, and this product. And just like that, cannabis becomes a trade good. Not the biggest or most valuable, sure, Silk and spices dominated the luxury markets, but cannabis, especially in regions where it wasn't already native, became a sought-after commodity. Traders carried seeds from Central Asia to the Middle East, from China to India, from the steppes to the Mediterranean coast, and wherever those seeds landed, the local populations experimented, adapted, and incorporated the plant into their own cultural practices. According to historians who study the Silk Road, this kind of botanical exchange was constant. Plants moved along trade routes just as readily as manufactured goods, and cannabis, with its multiple uses and relatively easy cultivation, was one of the most successful transplants. By the time of the Roman Empire, cannabis was known throughout the Mediterranean world, not just as a curiosity, but as a practical plant with recognized uses. But here's where the why question becomes even more layered, because as cannabis spread, so did the ideas about cannabis. A merchant might bring seeds, but a mystic or priest traveling the same route might bring rituals, stories, and techniques for using the plant in religious contexts. A soldier returning from a campaign might bring back smoking practices he'd learned from defeated enemies or allied tribes. And each time the plant moved, it picked up new meanings, new associations, and new reasons for being valued. Let's look at the Scythians again, because they're a perfect example of how cultural exchange and cannabis use reinforced each other. The Scythians weren't just warriors. They were traders, middlemen who controlled key sections of the steppes and demanded tribute or payment from caravans passing through their territory. They were in constant contact with Greek, Persian, Chinese, and Central Asian cultures, and according to Herodotus and archaeological evidence, they were passionate cannabis users. Now, when a Greek merchant or diplomat visited a Scythian camp and was invited into a vapor tent for a ritual smoke session, that wasn't just hospitality. It was a form of cultural initiation, a way of saying, "We trust you enough to share this with you." And when that Greek traveler returned home and told stories about the hemp seed vapor baths of the barbarians, he wasn't just gossiping. He was transmitting knowledge. Some listeners would have dismissed it as barbaric excess, but others, particularly those interested in medicine, philosophy, or religious innovation, would have been intrigued, and some of them would have sought out the plant, experimented with it, and integrated it into their own practices. This is how cultural transmission works. It's not a single moment of discovery. It's a slow, iterative process of exchange, adaptation, and reinvention. And cannabis, because it was so versatile, and because it produced such distinctive effects, was particularly good at spreading this way. You didn't need to be convinced by an argument. You just needed to try it once, in the right context, and you'd understand why people valued it. But let's not ignore the darker side of this story, because it's important. Cannabis wasn't always shared willingly. Conquest, slavery, and forced migration also spread the plant and its associated practices. When Alexander the Great's armies swept through Central Asia and into India in the 4th century BCE, they encountered cannabis-using cultures and brought that knowledge back to the Greek world. When the Roman legions conquered vast territories, they absorbed the local knowledge of medicinal plants, including cannabis. And when nomadic peoples like the Huns, and later the Mongols, swept across Eurasia, they carried their own traditions of cannabis use with them, imposing them on conquered populations or trading them with allies. The point is, cannabis spread through every available channel: trade, religion, medicine, war, migration, and simple human curiosity. And each time it arrived in a new place, people asked the same question: why would we use this? And they found their own answers. In Egypt, it became a treatment for eye diseases and inflammation. In Persia, it was used in Zoroastrian purification rites, though the evidence for this is disputed. In Greece and Rome, it was primarily a medicine, less commonly used for psychoactive purposes, but still recognized and documented. And here's what's wild. Despite the enormous geographic and cultural distances between these societies, the reasons for using cannabis were remarkably consistent: pain relief, spiritual communion, social bonding, and simply making life a bit easier. Those motivations don't change much across cultures because they're rooted in basic human needs, and cannabis, almost uniquely among psychoactive plants, could address multiple needs simultaneously without being immediately toxic or dangerously addictive, unlike, say, opium or alcohol, which could absolutely wreck lives and communities. Now, there's one more reason ancient people smoked cannabis that we haven't fully explored yet, and it's both the simplest and the most profound: curiosity. Humans are curious creatures. We taste things we shouldn't. We experiment with plants we find. We ask, what happens if I do this? And sometimes, what happens is remarkable enough that it gets passed down through generations, refined into tradition, and eventually becomes part of the cultural fabric. The first person who burned cannabis and inhaled the smoke probably wasn't trying to invent a sacrament or discover a medicine. They were probably just curious. Maybe the plant smelled interesting when it burned. Maybe they noticed animals acting strangely after eating it. Maybe it was a cold night, and they threw every available plant material onto the fire, and this one produced smoke that made everyone in the tent feel unusually relaxed and talkative. And from that single moment of curiosity, thousands of years of tradition emerged. That's the human story right there. We don't just use plants. We form relationships with them. We give them meaning. We incorporate them into our myths, our medicine, and our social rituals. And once a plant becomes meaningful, once it's tied to identity or spirituality or healing, it doesn't just disappear. It persists. It adapts. It travels. And cannabis, with its incredible versatility and its unique effects on human consciousness, was perfectly suited to become one of humanity's most enduring botanical companions. So why did ancient people smoke weed? Because it eased their pain. Because it connected them to the sacred. Because it brought them together. Because it made hard lives a little softer. Because it was profitable. Because it was there. And because once they tried it, they couldn't imagine living without it. And for thousands of years, they didn't have to. But that's not the end of the story. Because as cannabis spread across the ancient world, it didn't just move geographically. It evolved, adapted, and picked up new cultural meanings with every border it crossed. And the way it spread, the routes it traveled, and the people who carried it, that's where things get really fascinating. And that brings us to the next chapter: how this Central Asian plant became a global phenomenon long before the concept of globalization existed. How did weed smoking spread across the world? Let's dive into this. Now, we know ancient people were smoking cannabis for spiritual, medicinal, and social reasons across Central Asia, China, India, and the Eurasian steppes. But how did a plant native to the mountains and highlands of Central Asia end up literally everywhere? How did it jump from the Pamirs to Africa, from the Silk Road to the Caribbean, from shamanic rituals to being cultivated in nearly every climate zone on the planet? Here's the thing. Plants don't migrate on their own. They need vectors, wind, animals, water, or most effectively, humans. And cannabis had the perfect combination of traits to become one of history's most successful traveling companions. It was useful in multiple ways. It adapted to different climates surprisingly well. And most importantly, the people who encountered it wanted to take it with them, whether for rope, medicine, ritual, or recreation. Cannabis was valuable enough that traders, soldiers, priests, and migrants made sure it came along for the ride. Now, let's talk about the first great wave of cannabis dispersal. And it all comes back to the Silk Road. We've mentioned it before, but we need to understand just how transformative this network was. The Silk Road wasn't just an economic highway. It was a biological and cultural exchange system that operated for over a millennium, connecting civilizations that would otherwise never have interacted. And cannabis, both as hemp and as a psychoactive plant, was one of the countless goods flowing along those dusty, dangerous routes. According to historians and archaeologists, cannabis cultivation spread from its Central Asian homeland in multiple directions simultaneously, starting around 2000 to 1000 BCE. One route went south and west into the Indian subcontinent, where it merged with existing Vedic traditions and became deeply embedded in Hindu and later Buddhist practices. Another route went east into China, where it was primarily cultivated for fiber and seed, but also used medicinally and possibly in early Taoist rituals. And a third route went west through Persia and into the Middle East, eventually reaching the Mediterranean world. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't one-time transmissions. Cannabis seeds and knowledge moved back and forth along these routes for centuries, picking up new cultivation techniques, new uses, and new cultural associations with every transaction. A Chinese merchant might learn about high THC varieties from Central Asian traders. An Indian mystic traveling to study Buddhism in China might bring seeds and smoking techniques back home. A Greek physician stationed in Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan, might observe local cannabis use and incorporate it into his medical practice when he returned to Athens. Picture this. You're a merchant in the 1st century CE, leading a camel caravan from Samarkand to Damascus. The journey takes months. You're carrying silk, jade, spices, and a small pouch of cannabis seeds that a Scythian trader gave you in exchange for some copper vessels. He told you these particular seeds produce plants with strong medicinal properties and a resin that can be burned in ceremonies. You're skeptical, but curious. Along the route, you meet other traders, share stories, and one of them mentions that in India, holy men smoke this same plant to commune with their gods. By the time you reach Damascus, you're convinced this plant is worth cultivating. You sell some of the seeds to a local physician who's heard rumors about Eastern medicines. You keep some for yourself, thinking maybe you'll plant them back home. And just like that, cannabis has traveled another 1,000 miles. This happened thousands of times, across hundreds of years, through countless individual decisions to carry seeds, share knowledge, and experiment with new plants. And because the Silk Road connected so many different cultures, cannabis picked up a dizzying array of uses and meanings along the way. In some places, it remained primarily a fiber crop. In others, it became a medicine. And in a few special places, it became sacred. Now, let's talk about India specifically, because this is where cannabis smoking evolved into something culturally distinctive that would eventually influence the entire world. We've mentioned that cannabis appears in the Vedas and is associated with Shiva, but by the medieval period, roughly 500 to 1500 CE, cannabis use in India had developed into a sophisticated practice with its own vocabulary, rituals, and social structures. The Indian subcontinent became a major center of cannabis cultivation and use for several reasons. First, the climate was ideal. Cannabis thrives in warm, dry conditions with distinct wet and dry seasons, exactly what you find across much of northern India and the Himalayas. Second, Hindu and later Buddhist traditions had already incorporated cannabis into their religious frameworks, which meant there was cultural permission and even encouragement to use it. And third, India was a crossroads of trade routes connecting East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Africa and Europe. Ideas, goods, and plants flowed through Indian ports and cities constantly. According to historical texts and travelers' accounts, by the medieval period, cannabis was everywhere in Indian life. Bhang shops sold cannabis drinks to commoners. Sadhus, wandering holy men, smoked it openly as part of their spiritual practice. It was prescribed by Ayurvedic physicians for dozens of ailments. It was consumed during festivals, at weddings, and even given to soldiers before battle to steady their nerves. And different forms evolved for different purposes. Bhang, a drink made from leaves and flowers. Ganja, dried flower, smoked, and kharas, hand-rolled resin, similar to modern hash. And here's the kicker. India's cannabis culture didn't stay in India. It spread. When Indian merchants traveled to Southeast Asia, they brought cannabis with them. When Buddhist monks traveled to Tibet, China, and beyond, they carried knowledge of medicinal and ritual cannabis use. And when Islamic traders, who had their own complex relationship with cannabis, began dominating Indian Ocean trade routes from the 7th century onward, cannabis traveled with them to East Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and eventually the Mediterranean. Let's talk about the Islamic world for a moment, because this is where the story gets complicated. On one hand, Islamic law, particularly in its stricter interpretations, forbids intoxicants. The Quran explicitly bans alcohol, and many scholars extended that prohibition to other mind-altering substances, including cannabis. But on the other hand, cannabis was widely used across the Islamic world for centuries, particularly in Sufi mystical traditions, in medicine, and in social settings. According to historical accounts, cannabis was introduced to the Middle East and North Africa sometime between the 8th and 13th centuries, likely through contact with Central Asian and Indian traders. By the 13th century, it was common enough that religious scholars were writing opinions, fatwas, condemning its use, which tells us that enough people were using it to be a problem worth addressing officially. But here's the thing. Those condemnations didn't stop anybody. Cannabis, particularly in the form of hashish, concentrated resin, became deeply embedded in Middle Eastern and North African cultures despite religious prohibitions. Sufi mystics used it to facilitate meditation and spiritual experiences. Physicians prescribed it for pain and mental distress. And yes, ordinary people used it socially, much to the frustration of religious authorities. One of the most famous examples is the legend of the Hashashin, or assassins, a medieval Islamic sect that supposedly used hashish to induce visions of paradise before sending members on suicide missions. The story, popularized by Marco Polo and other European travelers, is almost certainly exaggerated or fabricated. Modern scholars largely dismiss it as a combination of cultural misunderstanding and deliberate slander. But the fact that the story existed and spread tells us something important. By the medieval period, cannabis use was well known enough in the Islamic world that Europeans hearing about it weren't surprised. They just misunderstood the context and added their own lurid details. Now, while cannabis was spreading west through Islamic trade networks, it was also moving south and east through different channels. Let's talk about Africa, because this is a part of the story that often gets overlooked, and it's crucial for understanding how cannabis eventually reached the Americas. According to archaeological and historical evidence, cannabis arrived in Africa through multiple routes. The earliest was probably through Egypt, where cannabis had been used medicinally since ancient times, though primarily in topical applications and oils, rather than smoking. But the real explosion of cannabis smoking in Africa came later, between the 13th and 16th centuries, through Indian Ocean trade routes. Arab and later Indian traders established extensive networks along Africa's eastern coast, trading gold, ivory, slaves, and all manner of goods with the interior kingdoms. And along with trade goods came plants, including cannabis. By the time Portuguese explorers reached East Africa in the late 15th century, they found cannabis already well established, cultivated by local populations for fiber, medicine, and yes, smoking. But here's where things get really interesting. In Africa, cannabis didn't just arrive and stay static, it evolved. Different African peoples developed their own unique ways of consuming it, their own rituals, their own terminology. In southern Africa, the Khoikhoi, and later the Zulu, developed a tradition called daga, smoking cannabis through water pipes made from animal horns or clay. In West Africa, cannabis arrived later, probably through trans-Saharan trade routes, and merged with existing traditions of using other psychoactive plants. And here's the kicker. When Europeans began the transatlantic slave trade in the 16th century, they didn't just kidnap millions of Africans and destroy countless lives and cultures. They also inadvertently created a vector for cannabis to spread to the Americas. Because enslaved Africans, torn from their homes and transported across the Atlantic, brought with them whatever they could carry: knowledge, stories, skills, and sometimes seeds. According to historians studying the African diaspora, enslaved people arriving in the Caribbean and South America in the 16th and 17th centuries brought knowledge of cannabis cultivation and use with them. In some cases, slave ships may have even carried cannabis as cargo, since it was valued for making rope and cordage. And once it arrived in the New World, cannabis found a climate that was, in many places, perfect for cultivation. Within a few generations, it was growing wild across the Caribbean islands, in parts of Mexico, and in South America. But that's not the only way cannabis reached the Americas. There is also evidence that it came through a completely different route: European colonialism. Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, familiar with hemp cultivation from Europe, where it had been used for centuries to make rope and textiles, brought cannabis seeds to their New World colonies explicitly to establish hemp plantations. The fiber was essential for ships' rigging, sails, and rope, and Europe couldn't supply enough for its expanding maritime empires. So, by the 17th century, cannabis was being cultivated in Spanish colonial Mexico, Portuguese Brazil, and even in British colonies in North America, primarily for hemp, but with the inevitable side effect that people discovered or remembered its psychoactive properties. Colonial authorities sometimes encouraged hemp cultivation and sometimes tried to suppress it when they realized slaves and poor workers were smoking it. But the plant was already loose. You can't UN introduce a species once it's thriving, and this brings us to a crucial point about how cannabis spread globally. It wasn't a single story. It was dozens of stories, overlapping and reinforcing each other. Trade routes, religious movements, military conquests, forced migrations, and colonial exploitation all played roles. Cannabis traveled as a commodity, as a medicine, as a sacrament, and sometimes just as a weed growing in the margins of cultivated fields. And wherever it went, people found uses for it. But here's what really gets me. Despite traveling thousands of miles and crossing countless cultural boundaries, the fundamental reasons people valued cannabis remained surprisingly consistent. Whether you were a Scythian warrior in 500 BCE, an Indian sadhu in 1000 CE, a North African Sufi in 1300 CE, or an enslaved African in the Caribbean in 1650 CE, you were using cannabis for the same basic reasons: spiritual connection, pain relief, social bonding, and simply making hard lives a little more bearable. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because while cannabis was quietly spreading across Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas through these ancient trade networks and human migrations, Europe remained almost completely ignorant of its psychoactive properties. Europeans had been growing hemp for centuries, using it to make everything from ship's rope to peasant clothing. But somehow, they never figured out that the plant could get you high. Or if they did, they didn't care enough to write about it or develop cultural practices around it. And that ignorance, that cultural blind spot, would have massive consequences when Europeans finally did discover cannabis smoking centuries later. Because part two? That's when things get really strange. So, where do we begin? We've traced cannabis from Central Asia to India, from the Silk Road to the Islamic world, from Africa to the Americas. But now we need to talk about the elephant in the room, Europe. Because here's something that will absolutely blow your mind. Europeans were growing cannabis for hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000 years. And somehow, almost nobody smoked it. Let me say that again. Europe had access to cannabis from at least the early medieval period, possibly earlier. They cultivated it extensively. They used the fiber for rope, textiles, and paper. They pressed the seeds for oil. They even used it medicinally in tinctures and topical applications. But the idea of smoking the dried flowers to get high, that was almost completely absent from European culture until the 19th century. It's like having a smartphone and only using it as a paperweight. Now, you might be wondering, how is that possible? How could they miss something so obvious? And the answer is partly botanical, partly cultural, and partly just historical accident. Let's break it down. First, the botanical reason. The cannabis that Europeans cultivated was primarily low THC hemp, varieties that had been selectively bred for thousands of years to produce long, strong fibers and lots of seeds but minimal psychoactive resin. This wasn't accidental. If you're growing cannabis for rope or textiles, you want plants that put their energy into stem growth, not flower production. And the climate in most of northern Europe, cool, damp, with long growing seasons, favored these low THC varieties. So, even if someone had tried smoking European hemp, they probably wouldn't have gotten very high. Maybe a mild headache, maybe nothing at all. But here's the thing. Europe traded with the Islamic world and with India, places where high-potency cannabis was well known and widely used. Surely someone, some merchant or traveler or curious scholar, must have noticed and brought that knowledge back. And the answer is, they did. But it didn't stick. According to historical records, there are scattered references to cannabis's psychoactive properties in European texts going back to the medieval period. The Persian physician Avicenna, whose medical texts were translated into Latin and widely read in European universities, described cannabis's intoxicating effects in the 11th century. The Roman author Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century CE, mentioned that cannabis seeds could cause infertility and visions if consumed in large quantities. And medieval European physicians, particularly those who had traveled to the East or studied Arabic medical texts, occasionally noted that cannabis could cause drowsiness, euphoria, or altered perception. But despite these references, cannabis smoking never became a European cultural practice. Why? The most likely answer is cultural inertia combined with religious disapproval. Medieval European Christianity was deeply suspicious of intoxication, altered states of consciousness, and anything that smacked of pagan or Eastern practices. Alcohol was tolerated, barely, and even then, excessive drinking was considered sinful. But smoking a plant to deliberately alter your consciousness, that was the kind of thing heathens and infidels did, not good Christians. And there was also a practical consideration. Europe already had alcohol, which was cheap, widely available, socially acceptable, and did a perfectly good job of getting people drunk. Beer and wine were staples of medieval European life, consumed daily by people of all social classes. So there wasn't really a cultural need for another intoxicant. Cannabis, in its psychoactive form, was a solution to a problem Europeans didn't think they had. But all of that changed, slowly at first, and then quite suddenly, in the 19th century. And the catalyst was European colonialism and the encounter with Indian cannabis culture. Let's talk about Napoleon, because this is where the modern European discovery of cannabis smoking really begins. In 1798, Napoleon invaded Egypt with a massive army, intending to disrupt British trade routes to India and establish French dominance in the region. The invasion was ultimately a military failure, but it had an unintended consequence. It introduced tens of thousands of French soldiers to hashish. According to contemporary accounts, Napoleon's troops quickly discovered that the local Egyptian and Syrian populations used hashish extensively, both medicinally and recreationally. And because alcohol was banned under Islamic law and hard to come by in the region, French soldiers started using hashish instead. At first, this was just a practical substitution. They wanted to get intoxicated, and this was what was available. But soon, hashish use became widespread enough that Napoleon became concerned about discipline and issued an official ban prohibiting his troops from consuming strong liquor made by Muslims from hemp and ordering that all hashish be confiscated. Of course, the ban didn't work. Soldiers kept using hashish anyway, and when they eventually returned to France, some of them brought the habit with them, but more importantly, they brought stories, tales of the exotic East, of strange drugs that produced visions and euphoria, of a plant that grew wild and could transport you to another world. And in the Romantic era, when European intellectuals and artists were obsessed with the Orient, with mysticism, with expanding consciousness, and breaking free from bourgeois constraints, those stories found a very receptive audience. By the 1840s, hashish had become fashionable among the Parisian artistic elite. Writers like Théophile Gautier, Charles Baudelaire, and Alexandre Dumas formed the Club des Hachishins, meeting regularly to consume hashish and discuss their experiences. They weren't just getting high for fun. They saw it as a tool for artistic inspiration, a way to access deeper truths and more vivid sensory experiences. Baudelaire wrote extensively about hashish in his book Les Paradis Artificiels, Artificial Paradises, comparing it to opium and alcohol, and exploring its effects on consciousness, creativity, and morality. But here's the kicker. Even among the Parisian avant-garde, hashish use remained fairly limited. It was expensive, it was exotic, and it required access to sources in North Africa or the Middle East. The average French person had no idea what hashish was and certainly couldn't afford to experiment with it. So, while cannabis smoking had arrived in Europe in a cultural sense, it remained the province of a tiny, elite subculture. Meanwhile, in Britain, something similar but slightly different was happening. British colonial expansion into India meant that thousands of British soldiers, administrators, merchants, and physicians were stationed in the subcontinent for months or years at a time. And unlike in France, where cannabis arrived as an exotic novelty, in British India, it was impossible to ignore. Cannabis was everywhere, in markets, in temples, in medical clinics, in soldiers' barracks. Indian workers and servants used it openly. Sadhus smoked it as part of their religious practice, and British officials, initially dismissive, gradually became curious. According to the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission report, a massive government study conducted in the 1890s, cannabis use in India was so widespread and so deeply embedded in the culture that the British colonial authorities had to decide whether to ban it, regulate it, or leave it alone. The commission interviewed hundreds of witnesses, doctors, religious leaders, soldiers, and users, and compiled a report that ran to over 3,000 pages. Their conclusion: cannabis was relatively harmless, especially compared to alcohol, and banning it would be impossible and probably counterproductive. But here's what's fascinating. The Commission's findings had almost no impact on European attitudes toward cannabis. British physicians read the report, and a few began experimenting with cannabis tinctures as medicine. A handful of intellectuals and bohemians, influenced by their French counterparts, tried hashish, but smoking cannabis never became a widespread British practice. It remained foreign, associated with Indians and other colonized peoples, and therefore somewhat suspect. So to recap, by 1900, Europeans were aware of cannabis smoking. They'd documented it extensively. and they'd even experimented with it in limited ways. But it still hadn't become part of European culture, and it wouldn't, not in any meaningful sense, until after World War II, when American jazz culture and counterculture movements finally brought cannabis smoking into the Western mainstream. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. That's a story for later. Now, while Europe was slowly and reluctantly discovering cannabis smoking, something much more significant was happening in the Americas. Because the cannabis that had arrived in the Caribbean and Latin America through African and European channels was evolving, spreading, and becoming embedded in local cultures in ways that would eventually reshape the entire global conversation about the plant. Let's talk about Mexico, because this is absolutely crucial for understanding how cannabis eventually reached the United States and became part of American culture. According to historians, cannabis arrived in Mexico through multiple routes. Spanish colonizers brought hemp for fiber cultivation as early as the 16th century, and later, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, Mexican laborers and sailors who had contact with Caribbean and South American ports brought back knowledge of cannabis smoking from Afro-Caribbean communities. By the early 20th century, cannabis use, particularly smoking, had become relatively common among certain populations in Mexico: soldiers, sailors, laborers, and the urban poor. It was called marijuana or marijuana, possibly derived from a Mexican slang term, or possibly from a personal name. It's unclear. But what is clear is that it had a reputation, and not a good one, from the perspective of Mexican elites and the Catholic Church. Cannabis smoking in Mexico was associated with the lower classes, with vice, with criminality, with rebellion. During the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, corridos, folk ballads, celebrated soldiers who smoked marijuana before battle, portraying it as something that gave courage and strength. La Cucaracha, a famous revolutionary song, includes lyrics about a cockroach who can't walk because he doesn't have marijuana to smoke. It's playful, but it also reflects that cannabis was part of popular culture, at least among certain groups. And here's where it gets interesting. As the Mexican Revolution created chaos and economic disruption, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans migrated north into the United States, particularly to Texas, California, and the Southwest, and they brought their culture with them, including cannabis. According to U.S. immigration and law enforcement records from the 1910s and 1920s, American authorities began encountering marijuana for the first time, and they had no idea what it was. Remember, Americans had been growing hemp for centuries. George Washington grew it. Thomas Jefferson grew it. It was a standard agricultural crop. But smoking it, that was new, foreign, and associated with Mexican immigrants who were already facing intense racial prejudice and discrimination. Local newspapers began running sensational stories about Mexican loco weed that drove users insane and made them violent. Police departments in border states reported, often wildly exaggerating, incidents involving marijuana use. And gradually, over the 1910s and 1920s, individual states began passing laws banning marijuana, usually framing it as a public safety measure aimed at controlling Mexican immigrant populations. Now, it's important to understand that this wasn't really about the drug. It was about race, xenophobia, and social control. Cannabis had been in America for centuries, without anyone caring. But now, because it was associated with Mexicans, and because Mexicans were convenient scapegoats during a period of economic anxiety and nativist backlash, cannabis became a problem that needed solving. And at the same time, in the 1920s and 1930s, cannabis was also spreading through another marginalized community, African American jazz musicians. According to oral histories and contemporary accounts, cannabis arrived in New Orleans and other southern cities through Caribbean sailors and laborers, many of them of African descent. Jazz musicians, who worked late nights in clubs and speakeasies, discovered that cannabis enhanced their musical experience, made them more creative, and helped them connect with the rhythm and improvisation that defined the genre. And because jazz culture was mobile, moving from New Orleans to Chicago, to New York, to Kansas City, cannabis smoking spread along with it. By the 1930s, marijuana was common enough in Harlem and other urban black neighborhoods that it had its own slang, tea, reefer, muggles, its own rituals, and its own cultural associations. It was cool, it was rebellious, and it was, not coincidentally, absolutely terrifying to white mainstream America. So, by 1930, cannabis smoking had finally arrived in the West in a meaningful way. But it didn't arrive as the sacred plant of ancient shamans, or the medicinal herb of Indian physicians, or even the exotic intoxicant of Parisian poets. It arrived as a Mexican and Negro vice, something associated with criminality, deviance, and racial minorities. And that association, that framing, would shape everything that came next. Because what happened over the next few decades wasn't just a moral panic or a drug war. It was a systematic campaign to erase thousands of years of human relationship with this plant and replace it with fear, criminalization, and control. And that story, that's when things get truly dark. When did the West discover smoking weed? All right, here's where things get interesting. Because discovery is a loaded word, isn't it? Europeans didn't discover cannabis smoking. They encountered it belatedly and often reluctantly after thousands of years of human use across Asia, Africa, and eventually the Americas. But the way Western societies came to understand, categorize, and ultimately criminalize cannabis smoking is a story that says far more about Western anxieties, prejudices, and power structures than it does about the plant itself. Let's talk about the 19th century first, because this is when Western medicine and Western imperialism collided with cannabis in a way that briefly, very briefly, looked like it might lead to acceptance rather than prohibition. And it all started in India. Picture this. It's the 1830s. The British Empire controls vast swaths of the Indian subcontinent, and British physicians stationed there are encountering medical practices that are completely foreign to Western medicine. One of those practices is the use of cannabis in various forms, bhang, ganja, garas, to treat everything from pain and inflammation to epilepsy and mental distress. And unlike some folk remedies that seem to be pure superstition, cannabis actually worked. Patients who took it reported genuine relief from symptoms. Physicians who tested it on themselves noted its effects: pain reduction, muscle relaxation, altered perception, and in some cases, profound mood changes. The most famous of these early medical investigators was Dr. William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician working for the British East India Company. In 1839, O'Shaughnessy published a groundbreaking paper describing his experiments with cannabis on animals and humans. He'd tested it as a treatment for rabies, cholera, tetanus, and convulsions, and while his results were mixed, cannabis doesn't cure rabies, unfortunately. He demonstrated clearly that it was an effective analgesic and muscle relaxant with relatively few side effects. According to his published reports, O'Shaughnessy was genuinely excited about cannabis's therapeutic potential. He wrote that it possesses great powers and recommended it be adopted into British pharmacology. And for a while, it was. By the 1850s, cannabis extracts and tinctures were available in British and American pharmacies, sold under brand names like Squire's extract or Tilden's extract. They were prescribed for menstrual cramps, migraines, insomnia, and dozens of other conditions. Cannabis had, briefly, become a legitimate Western medicine. But here's the thing. Western physicians weren't smoking cannabis. They were prescribing it in tincture form, alcohol-based extracts of cannabinoids that patients would take orally in carefully measured doses. This was medicine, administered by doctors, regulated by pharmacies, and framed entirely within Western medical rationality. Smoking cannabis, by contrast, was still seen as something foreigners did, Indians, Arabs, Africans, not something a respectable European or American would engage in. And that distinction matters, because it allowed Western societies to accept cannabis as a medicine, while simultaneously viewing cannabis smoking as a vice. The plant itself wasn't the problem, it was the method of consumption, and more importantly, the people associated with that method. That made Westerners uncomfortable, but even cannabis tinctures didn't last long in Western medicine. By the early 20th century, they were falling out of favor for several reasons. First, the potency was inconsistent. Cannabis extracts varied wildly in strength depending on the source plant, the extraction method, and storage conditions. A dose that worked one time might be too weak or too strong the next. Second, cannabis was hard to standardize, which was a problem in an era when medicine was becoming increasingly scientific and precise. And third, new synthetic drugs were being developed, aspirin, barbiturates, and opiates that were more reliable, easier to dose, and didn't carry the cultural baggage of association with colonized peoples. So by 1920 or so, cannabis had mostly disappeared from Western pharmacies, not because it didn't work, but because it was inconvenient and politically complicated. And that might have been the end of the story, cannabis as a footnote in medical history, if it weren't for what was happening at the same time in a completely different context, recreational use among marginalized communities in the United States. Now, let's talk about how cannabis smoking actually entered American culture, because this is where the Western discovery becomes less about medicine and more about race, class, and moral panic. And it all starts, as we mentioned before, with Mexican immigration in the 1910s, as the Mexican Revolution created chaos and economic devastation. Hundreds of thousands of Mexicans crossed into the United States looking for work, safety, and stability. They settled primarily in the Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California, taking jobs in agriculture, mining, and railroad construction. And some of them, not all, but enough to be noticed, brought with them the practice of smoking cannabis, according to newspaper accounts from the period, and take these with a massive grain of salt, because they're incredibly biased. American authorities began encountering marijuana in Mexican neighborhoods and labor camps. Police didn't know what it was at first, It looked like tobacco, smelled strange when burned, and seemed to make users relaxed or euphoric. Local officials, already hostile toward Mexican immigrants because of racism and economic competition, quickly decided this was dangerous, not because they had evidence, but because anything associated with Mexicans was automatically suspect. And here's where it gets dark. Newspapers, particularly in Texas and California, began running sensational stories about marijuana-crazed Mexicans committing crimes, attacking white women, or losing their minds. These stories were almost entirely fabricated or wildly exaggerated, but they fed into existing prejudices and fears. Cannabis became a symbol of Mexican degeneracy, proof that these immigrants were bringing crime and moral decay into respectable American communities. One particularly influential figure in this early anti-cannabis campaign was Dr. Hamilton Wright, who in 1910 testified before Congress about drug use in America. Wright didn't focus much on cannabis. He was more concerned about opium and cocaine, but he did note that Mexicans were using a drug called marijuana and that it was spreading into border states. That was enough to plant a seed of concern that would grow over the next 2 decades. But cannabis wasn't just coming from Mexico. At almost the same time, it was also spreading through African American communities, particularly in the South, via a completely different route: Caribbean immigration and the jazz scene. And this terrified white America even more than Mexican cannabis use, because it suggested that cannabis might spread beyond immigrant enclaves into the broader culture. Let's talk about New Orleans, because this is where cannabis and jazz culture first intersected in a way that would shape American perceptions for the next century. New Orleans in the 1910s and 1920s was a wild, vibrant, deeply segregated city. It was a major port, which meant sailors from all over the world, including the Caribbean, passed through regularly. And among those sailors were men who had encountered cannabis in Jamaica, Haiti, Cuba, and other islands where it had been cultivated and used for generations by Afro-Caribbean populations. According to oral histories from jazz musicians of that era, cannabis arrived in New Orleans through these sailors and quickly found its way into the clubs, speakeasies, and informal gatherings where jazz was being born. Musicians discovered that cannabis made them more receptive to music, more able to lose themselves in improvisation, and more connected to the rhythms and harmonies they were creating. It became part of the culture, passed around in backstage rooms and after-hours sessions. And as jazz music spread, from New Orleans to Chicago, to Kansas City, to New York, cannabis traveled with it. By the late 1920s, you could find tea pads, essentially cannabis speakeasies, in Harlem and other urban black neighborhoods. These were often just someone's apartment where people could come, pay a small fee, smoke, listen to music, and socialize. They were relatively peaceful, far less rowdy than alcohol speakeasies. But to white authorities and mainstream America, they represented something terrifying. Black people using a drug that made them, in the racist imagination, more dangerous, more sexual, more threatening to white society. Now, you might be wondering, wait, why was everyone so scared of cannabis when alcohol was legal and far more destructive? Good question. And the answer is, alcohol wasn't legal. This was Prohibition, 1920 to 1933, when the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol were banned nationwide. And Prohibition was a spectacular failure. creating massive criminal enterprises, corrupting law enforcement, and generally making a mockery of federal authority. But here's the thing. By the early 1930s, it was becoming obvious that prohibition would be repealed. The political will to keep alcohol banned was crumbling, and that created a problem for a specific group of people, the federal agents and bureaucrats whose careers and budgets depended on enforcing drug laws. If alcohol were re-legalized, what would they do? What would justify their existence? Enter Harry J. Anslinger. And this is where the story takes a turn from historical curiosity into a deliberate, systematic propaganda campaign that would shape global drug policy for the next 80 years. Anslinger was appointed head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the predecessor to the DEA, in 1930. He was ambitious, politically savvy, and absolutely ruthless in pursuing policies that would expand his power and budget. And in the early 1930s, as prohibition was collapsing, he needed a new enemy. He needed a new drug to crusade against, something that would justify continued funding and give his agency a mission. And he found it in cannabis. Or rather, he invented it. Because here's the thing. Anslinger didn't start out caring about cannabis at all. In fact, in 1929, he'd testified to Congress that cannabis was not a significant problem and that there was no need for federal legislation against it. But by 1934, his position had completely reversed. Suddenly, cannabis was the most dangerous drug in America, a threat to the moral fabric of society, and a scourge that required immediate federal action. What changed? Politics. Anslinger realized that he could use racism and fear to whip up public support for cannabis prohibition, and he was absolutely shameless about it. According to historians who've studied Anslinger's speeches, testimony, and internal memos, he deliberately stoked racial fears to build support for criminalizing cannabis. He gave speeches claiming that marijuana caused black men to become violent and lust after white women. He testified before Congress that marijuana made Mexican immigrants go insane and commit murder. He circulated fabricated stories about marijuana atrocities, heinous crimes that were supposedly committed by people under the influence of cannabis, even though there was no evidence that any of these stories were true. He also made sure to use the Spanish term marijuana rather than cannabis or hemp, which Americans were already familiar with. By using a foreign-sounding word, he could make the drug seem more exotic, more threatening, more associated with dangerous outsiders. It was a deliberate propaganda technique, and it worked brilliantly. And here's what really gets me. Anslinger wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was supported by powerful industries that had their own reasons to want cannabis banned. The newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst, who owned vast timber holdings used to produce paper, saw hemp as a potential competitor and used his newspapers to publish sensational anti-marijuana stories. The DuPont Chemical Company was developing synthetic fibers like nylon that would compete with hemp textiles and had every reason to support prohibition. These weren't conspiracy theories. These were documented business interests that aligned perfectly with Anslinger's crusade. But that's not even the weirdest part. Because while Anslinger was demonizing cannabis and building the case for federal prohibition, something else was happening in American culture that would complicate the story in unexpected ways. Cannabis was becoming cool, not to mainstream America, not yet, but to a growing subculture of artists, musicians, and rebels who saw it as a symbol of resistance against the very establishment that was trying to ban it. And that cultural cachet, that association with creativity and rebellion, would never fully go away, even after decades of criminalization and propaganda. And that tension between prohibition and fascination, between demonization and romanticization, would define Western attitudes toward cannabis for the next century. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because part 2 is where Anslinger's campaign reaches its horrifying conclusion, and where the Western discovery of cannabis smoking transforms into one of the most destructive policy mistakes in modern history. Let's dive into this. By the mid-1930s, Harry Anslinger had built a propaganda machine that would make modern political operatives jealous. He had the backing of powerful industries, a compliant media willing to print whatever sensational garbage he fed them, and a political climate ripe with racial anxiety and economic insecurity. All he needed now was to turn his crusade into actual law. And in 1937, he got his wish. Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, effectively criminalizing cannabis at the federal level. Now, technically, the law didn't outright ban cannabis. It imposed such punitive taxes and regulatory requirements on cannabis cultivation, distribution, and possession that it became functionally illegal. If you wanted to grow, sell, or possess cannabis legally, you needed a tax stamp. But the government refused to issue tax stamps. It was a legal prohibition with a thin veneer of taxation designed to survive constitutional challenges. According to congressional records, the hearings for the Marijuana Tax Act were shockingly brief and one-sided. Anslinger testified, presenting his fabricated horror stories about marijuana-induced violence and insanity. A few representatives from the hemp industry tried to object, pointing out that the law would destroy legitimate hemp farming, but they were largely ignored. The American Medical Association sent a representative, Dr. William Woodward, who testified that there was no medical evidence that cannabis was dangerous and that prohibition would interfere with legitimate medical research and use. He was basically told to sit down and shut up. The entire legislative process took only a few months. Most congressmen had no idea what marijuana was, had never seen it, and relied entirely on Anslinger's testimony. And why wouldn't they? He was a federal law enforcement official, testifying under oath, presenting what appeared to be factual evidence. The idea that he might be deliberately lying, manipulating statistics, and fabricating stories to advance his career probably didn't occur to them. Or if it did, they didn't care, because cannabis was associated with Mexicans and black people, and passing tough-on-crime legislation made them look good to their constituents. And just like that, cannabis went from a plant that Americans had been growing for centuries, that was sitting in medicine cabinets across the country, that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had cultivated on their plantations, to a Schedule I narcotic classified alongside heroin and cocaine as having no legitimate medical use and a high potential for abuse. But here's the kicker. The federal ban didn't end cannabis use. It just drove it underground and guaranteed that everyone who used it would be a criminal. Jazz musicians kept smoking, Mexican laborers kept smoking, and slowly, quietly, cannabis began spreading into other communities, bohemians, intellectuals, and eventually white middle-class kids who were drawn to it precisely because It was forbidden and associated with cool, rebellious subcultures. Now, let's talk about what was happening during World War II and the immediate post-war period, because this is where the story gets genuinely weird. In 1942, just 5 years after criminalizing cannabis, the US government launched a campaign called Hemp for Victory, encouraging American farmers to grow cannabis, hemp, to support the war effort. Why? Japan had cut off America's access to Manila hemp, which was essential for making rope for the Navy. Suddenly, cannabis wasn't a dangerous narcotic. It was a patriotic crop, according to the promotional film the government produced, which you can still watch today. Farmers were told that hemp was one of the oldest crops known to humanity, essential for civilization, and critical to winning the war. The government distributed seeds, provided production quotas, and even exempted hemp farmers from the draft. And then, the moment the war ended, the program was quietly shut down. The film was buried, and the government went back to pretending cannabis was pure evil. It's almost funny, except it's not, because it reveals the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of cannabis prohibition. The plant wasn't banned because it was inherently dangerous. It was banned because certain people using it were considered dangerous. And when those same authorities needed the plant for their own purposes, they had no problem reversing course, temporarily, and then pretending it never happened. Meanwhile, through the 1940s and 1950s, cannabis use continued to spread, slowly but steadily, particularly among artists, musicians, and the emerging beat generation. Writers like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac, and William S. Burroughs experimented with cannabis and other drugs as part of their exploration of consciousness, creativity, and rebellion against conformist 1950s America. And they wrote about it openly and poetically in works that would influence millions of young people in the decades to come. But mainstream America still saw cannabis as a fringe vice, something that happened in jazz clubs and Greenwich Village bohemian apartments, not in suburban living rooms. That perception was carefully maintained by continued propaganda. In the 1950s, the hysteria around cannabis actually intensified. The Boggs Act of 1951 and the Narcotics Control Act of 1956 imposed mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including cannabis possession. First offense, 2 to 10 years. Second offense, 5 to 20 years. And these weren't slaps on the wrist. People actually went to prison for years for possessing a plant, and Harry Anslinger was still at it, testifying before Congress in the 1950s that marijuana was a gateway drug that led inevitably to heroin addiction. This claim had zero scientific support, but it became one of the foundational myths of the war on drugs, repeated so often that people just accepted it as fact. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but when did cannabis actually become mainstream in the West? When did it stop being a fringe thing and become part of popular culture? And the answer is the 1960s. That's when everything changed. Let's talk about the counterculture, because this is when Western cannabis use exploded from thousands of users to millions. And it happened because of a perfect storm of social forces. The civil rights movement challenging racial hierarchies, the anti-war movement questioning government authority, the sexual revolution rejecting traditional morality, and the rise of rock and roll, creating a youth culture that defined itself in opposition to mainstream values. According to sociologists who study the 1960s counterculture, cannabis became a symbol of rebellion, a way for young people to reject the values of their parents' generation. Smoking weed wasn't just about getting high, it was a political act, a statement that you didn't accept the government's authority to tell you what you could put in your body, that you questioned the logic of a society that banned a relatively harmless plant while celebrating alcohol and tobacco, and that you identified with the marginalized communities, Black, Mexican, artistic, that had been using cannabis all along. The spread was exponential. In 1960, cannabis use among American college students was probably less than 5%. By 1970, it was closer to 40%. Millions of young people, mostly white, mostly middle class, were now smoking a drug that had been associated almost exclusively with racial minorities just a generation earlier. And this terrified the establishment. But here's what's fascinating. The very act of middle-class white kids smoking cannabis began to change how society viewed it. When cannabis users were primarily Black and Mexican, the response was harsh criminalization with no debate. But when cannabis users included the children of doctors, lawyers, and congressmen, suddenly there were questions. Should we really be sending college kids to prison for smoking pot? Is cannabis actually as dangerous as we've been told? Why is this illegal when alcohol isn't? These questions led to serious research for the first time in decades. In 1969, President Nixon appointed the Schaeffer Commission to study marijuana and make recommendations. And in 1972, after extensive research, the commission concluded that cannabis was far less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, that criminal penalties were disproportionate and counterproductive, and that personal use should be decriminalized. Nixon ignored the report completely. In fact, he doubled down, launching the modern war on drugs in 1971 and making cannabis a Schedule Y drug under the Controlled Substances Act, legally classifying it as more dangerous than cocaine or methamphetamine. According to Nixon's own advisors, revealed in recordings that came out decades later, this wasn't about public health. It was about politics. John Ehrlichman, Nixon's domestic policy advisor, later admitted, "We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." Let me say that again. The modern criminalization of cannabis, the policy that led to millions of arrests and incarcerations over the next 50 years, was explicitly designed as a tool of political repression and racial control. It wasn't about protecting public health. It was about targeting Nixon's political enemies, anti-war activists, and Black communities. And this policy was then exported globally. The United States used its economic and political power to pressure other countries to adopt similar prohibitionist policies. The 1961 UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, which the U.S. helped draft and promote, required signatory nations to criminalize cannabis. Countries that had traditional cannabis use, India, Morocco, and Jamaica, were forced to ban or restrict practices that had existed for centuries, all because Western powers, led by the United States, decided cannabis was dangerous based on racist propaganda and political convenience. So, when did the West discover smoking weed? If by discover you mean encounter and document it, that happened in the 19th century through colonial contact with India, the Middle East, and Africa. If you mean when it entered Western medical practice, that was the 1840s through 1900s. If you mean when it became part of Western popular culture, that was the 1910s through 1930s, first among marginalized communities, and then spreading slowly outward. And if you mean when it became a mainstream phenomenon that changed Western society, that was the 1960s and 1970s. But here's the most important point. The West didn't really discover anything. Cannabis had been part of human culture for millennia. What the West did was encounter an ancient plant, misunderstand it through the lens of racism and political opportunism, criminalize it despite evidence of its relative safety, and then export that criminalization globally, disrupting traditional practices and creating one of the most destructive and unjust policy regimes in modern history. And the consequences? They're still playing out today, because the war on drugs, built on the foundation of cannabis prohibition, has resulted in millions of arrests, overwhelmingly of black and brown people, despite similar usage rates across racial groups. It's destroyed countless lives, separated families, created a massive prison industrial complex, and cost taxpayers hundreds of billions of dollars, all in pursuit of a policy that was founded on lies from the very beginning. But here's the thing, the story doesn't end there, because even as the West was criminalizing cannabis and exporting that criminalization worldwide, something else was happening. People kept using it. They kept studying it. They kept pushing back against the propaganda. And slowly, painfully, over decades, the truth began to emerge. Cannabis wasn't the monster Anslinger had claimed. The prohibition was causing far more harm than the plant ever could. And eventually, that realization would lead to the beginning of the end of prohibition itself. But that change didn't come from governments suddenly realizing they'd made a mistake. It came from activists, patients, scientists, and ordinary people who refused to accept the lies. And the story of how cannabis went from the most demonized drug in the West to being re-legalized in state after state, country after country, that's where things get truly interesting, because that battle isn't over yet. Why did governments ban smoking weed? So, where do we begin? We've established that cannabis prohibition wasn't based on science, wasn't driven by genuine public health concerns, and didn't emerge from any objective assessment of the plant's actual risks. So the real question is, if cannabis wasn't particularly dangerous, why did governments around the world spend the entire 20th century treating it like it was? The answer, unfortunately, is depressingly simple. Cannabis was banned because banning it served powerful political, economic, and racial interests. It had almost nothing to do with the plant itself, and everything to do with controlling certain populations, protecting certain industries, and projecting certain kinds of political authority. Let me walk you through exactly how this happened, because the story of cannabis prohibition is really a story about power, prejudice, and propaganda. Let's start with the most uncomfortable truth. In America, which drove global cannabis prohibition, the ban was rooted in racism, not subtle, dog whistle racism, explicit, on the record, stated in congressional testimony racism. We've already mentioned Harry Anslinger's role, but we need to understand just how central racial fear-mongering was to his entire strategy. According to historians who've studied Anslinger's speeches and writings, his anti-cannabis campaign relied heavily on linking the drug to racial minorities and then stoking white fears about those minorities. He told Congress and the press that marijuana made black men violent and sexually aggressive toward white women, a claim that tapped directly into America's long, horrific history of racist lynching justifications. He claimed that marijuana made Mexican immigrants go insane and commit murder. He circulated stories, most of them fabricated or wildly distorted, about marijuana atrocities committed almost exclusively by non-white users. And this wasn't just rhetoric. It shaped actual policy. When individual states began passing anti-marijuana laws in the 1910s and 1920s, the language used in legislative debates and newspaper coverage was shockingly explicit. In Texas, a state senator argued that marijuana was a Mexican problem and that banning it would help control the immigrant population. In Louisiana, newspapers claimed that Negro marijuana users were a threat to white communities. These weren't fringe voices. This was mainstream political discourse. But here's what makes this even more insidious. The racial panic wasn't based on actual crime statistics or public health data. It was manufactured. According to research by historians like Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, cannabis use rates across racial groups in the 1920s and 1930s were actually fairly similar. Or at least, there was no evidence that Black and Mexican communities used cannabis at dramatically higher rates than white communities. But arrest and prosecution rates told a completely different story. Non-white cannabis users were arrested, charged, and imprisoned at vastly disproportionate rates. So cannabis prohibition became a tool for selective enforcement, a way to criminalize and control populations that the white power structure found threatening. And this pattern would continue for the next century. Even today, despite similar usage rates across racial groups, Black Americans are nearly 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession than white Americans. That's not an accident. It's the legacy of a prohibition regime that was designed, from its inception, to be racist. Now, let's talk about the economic interests that supported prohibition, because racism alone doesn't explain why cannabis remained illegal for so long, or why prohibition spread globally. There were also powerful industries that benefited from keeping cannabis banned. We've mentioned William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate who owned vast timber holdings and saw hemp as a competitive threat to his paper production business. But the story goes deeper than just one businessman protecting his investments. In the 1930s, several emerging industries had reason to fear hemp competition. The timber industry, the emerging synthetic fiber industry, particularly DuPont, which was developing nylon and rayon, and the pharmaceutical industry, which was moving away from plant-based medicines toward synthetic, patentable drugs. According to economic historians, hemp was a genuinely competitive crop in multiple sectors. Hemp fiber could be used for paper, textiles, rope, and building materials. Hemp seed oil could be used for fuel and industrial lubricants, and hemp required less processing and fewer chemicals than many alternatives. If hemp cultivation had been allowed to develop with modern agricultural and processing technologies, it might have captured significant market share from established industries. Now, did these industries directly lobby for cannabis prohibition? The historical record is murkier than conspiracy theorists sometimes claim. There's no smoking gun memo where DuPont executives say, "Let's ban hemp to protect our nylon patents." But there's evidence of coordination, shared interests, and financial support for prohibitionist politicians and media campaigns. And Hearst's newspapers definitely published sensationalized anti-marijuana stories that served both his ideological biases and his economic interests. The key point is this: cannabis prohibition wasn't opposed by any powerful economic interests. Nobody with money and political influence was fighting to keep it legal, because the people who used it, Mexican immigrants, black jazz musicians, bohemian artists, had no political power, and the industries that might have benefited from legal hemp cultivation, farmers, textile makers, were either unaware of the threat or unable to organize effective opposition in time. So, prohibition sailed through with almost no resistance, supported by racist fear-mongering and tacitly backed by industrial interests that saw no downside to banning a plant that might compete with their products. But there's another dimension to this story that often gets overlooked: institutional self-interest. Government agencies, once created, develop a powerful survival instinct. They need to justify their budgets, expand their authority, and demonstrate their relevance. And in the 1930s, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, under Anslinger's leadership, desperately needed a new mission. According to administrative historians who study federal bureaucracy, the FBN was facing a crisis in the early 1930s. Alcohol prohibition was clearly failing and would be repealed in 1933. The agency's original mission, enforcing alcohol and narcotics laws, was about to get cut in half, and without a major drug threat to justify its existence, the FBN risked budget cuts, staff reductions, or even dissolution. Cannabis provided the perfect solution. It was already being used by unpopular minority groups, making it easy to demonize. It was easy to arrest people for, since it often smelled distinctive and was consumed in social settings. And most importantly, cannabis use was widespread enough that a war against it could be endless, providing job security for federal agents and justifying ever-increasing budgets. This pattern would repeat throughout the 20th century. Every time drug enforcement agencies faced budget pressures or criticism, they would ramp up anti-drug rhetoric, conduct high-profile raids, and claim that the drug threat was worse than ever: cannabis. Because it was so widely used and so easy to detect and prosecute, became the reliable workhorse of the drug war, the one that guaranteed steady arrest numbers and justified continued funding. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so racism, economic interests, and bureaucratic self-preservation explain why the US banned cannabis. But how did that become global policy? Why did countries that had no history of anti-cannabis sentiment suddenly ban it? And that's where American imperialism comes into the picture. After World War II, the United States emerged as the dominant global superpower, and it used that power to export its drug policies worldwide. The mechanism was primarily through the United Nations and international treaties, particularly the 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. According to diplomatic historians, the U.S. pushed hard for the Single Convention to include cannabis alongside opiates and coca, despite objections from countries like India, Morocco, and Egypt, where cannabis had been used traditionally for centuries. The U.S. argument was that drug control needed to be universal and standardized, that allowing any exceptions would create loopholes for trafficking, and that scientific evidence, which didn't exist, showed cannabis was dangerous, and addictive. Countries that objected faced diplomatic pressure and, in some cases, economic threats. The U.S. made it clear that foreign aid, trade agreements, and political support might depend on cooperation with American drug policy. And for developing nations that relied on U.S. assistance or access to U.S. markets, that was a compelling argument, regardless of what their own cultural traditions or medical evidence might suggest. So by the 1970s, cannabis was illegal almost everywhere in the world, not because every country independently assessed the risks and decided prohibition was the right policy, but because one country, the United States, imposed its policy preferences on everyone else through economic and political coercion. And here's the kicker. Many of these countries had no domestic cannabis problem before prohibition. Cannabis use was either rare or culturally accepted and uncontroversial. But once it was banned, once criminal penalties were attached and enforcement began, it became a problem. Criminalization created black markets, which attracted organized crime, which led to violence and corruption, which then justified more aggressive enforcement and harsher penalties. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's still playing out in countries around the world today. But there's one more layer to this story that we need to understand. Governments didn't just ban cannabis to control minorities, protect industries, or expand bureaucratic power. They also banned it because cannabis represented something deeper and more threatening. It challenged the state's authority to control consciousness itself. Think about it. What you're allowed to think, feel, and experience, even in the privacy of your own mind, is one of the most fundamental aspects of personal freedom. And psychoactive substances, by definition, alter consciousness. They give individuals the power to change their mental states without permission, without mediation by doctors or priests or government officials. And that kind of autonomy, especially when exercised by populations the state already sees as threatening or uncontrollable, is profoundly unsettling to authority. According to political theorists who study drug prohibition, this is one of the deeper reasons why governments have been so zealous in prosecuting drug use, particularly of psychoactive drugs like cannabis that are relatively safe but produce noticeable alterations in consciousness. It's not really about protecting public health. If it were, alcohol and tobacco would be banned, and cannabis would be legal. It's about maintaining control over what kinds of consciousness are acceptable, and who gets to decide what goes into your body and mind. And cannabis, because it's been associated with counterculture, with questioning authority, with artistic creativity and spiritual exploration, has always represented that threat more acutely than almost any other substance. The 1960s made this explicit. Cannabis wasn't just a drug hippies used. It was a symbol of their entire worldview: anti-war, anti-establishment, pro-personal freedom, skeptical of authority. And governments, particularly the Nixon administration, responded by doubling down on prohibition, explicitly using drug enforcement as a tool to disrupt and control these movements. So why did governments ban smoking weed? Because it gave them a way to criminalize racial minorities without explicitly passing racist laws. Because it protected certain economic interests. Because it justified the existence and expansion of law enforcement bureaucracies. Because it allowed them to project their power globally. And because it represented a form of personal autonomy and consciousness alteration that threatened the state's authority to control how people think and feel. And all of that, every single justification, was built on a foundation of lies, fabricated evidence, and deliberate manipulation of public fear. The plant itself was never the problem. The problem was that the wrong people were using it, and those people needed to be controlled. And that's not even the darkest part, because part 2, that's when we see exactly what those lies cost. All right, here's where things get really dark. Because we've talked about why governments banned cannabis, the racist motivations, the economic interests, the bureaucratic self-preservation, and the imperialism. But now, we need to talk about the consequences of those decisions. And those consequences weren't abstract policy debates or theoretical harm reduction discussions. They were real lives destroyed, families torn apart, communities devastated, and entire populations systematically oppressed under the guise of public health and safety. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. According to FBI crime statistics, there have been over 25 million cannabis arrests in the United States since 1965. 25 million. That's roughly one arrest every minute for over half a century. And the vast majority of those arrests, somewhere between 80–90%, were for simple possession, not distribution or trafficking. We're talking about people arrested, booked, fingerprinted, and given criminal records for having a plant in their pocket. Now, you might think, okay, but most of those were probably just fines or warnings, right? Nobody actually went to prison for small amounts of weed. Wrong. According to the ACLU and other criminal justice organizations, hundreds of thousands of Americans have served time in jail or prison for cannabis offenses, some for years or even decades, under mandatory minimum sentencing laws. And even when people didn't go to prison, a cannabis arrest could destroy their lives in other ways. Loss of employment, loss of student financial aid, loss of public housing, loss of voting rights in some states, and the permanent stigma of a criminal record that made it nearly impossible to find decent work or housing ever again. And here's the thing that should make your blood boil. These consequences were not distributed equally across society. According to decades of research, white and black Americans use cannabis at roughly similar rates. Depending on the study, usage is either equal or slightly higher among white Americans. But black Americans are arrested for cannabis possession at nearly 4 times the rate of white Americans, even in states where cannabis use patterns are identical across racial groups. Let me say that again. Similar usage rates. 4 times the arrest rate. That's not about drugs. That's about racism, baked into every level of the system, from police patrol patterns, to prosecutorial discretion, to sentencing guidelines. According to the ACLU's 2013 report, The War on Marijuana in Black and White, this disparity exists in every single state, in counties and cities across the country, regardless of local demographics or poverty rates. The racial disparity in cannabis arrests isn't a bug in the system. It's a feature inherited directly from the racist origins of prohibition and perpetuated by law enforcement practices that target black and brown communities disproportionately. And the consequences go beyond individual arrests. According to sociologist Michelle Alexander and other researchers studying mass incarceration, the war on drugs, with cannabis prohibition as its foundation, essentially created a new system of racial control in America. After the civil rights movement made explicit racial discrimination illegal, drug enforcement became a legally sanctioned way to continue segregating, disenfranchising, and controlling black communities. Police could justify stopping, searching, and arresting black people by claiming they smelled marijuana. Prosecutors could use drug charges to coerce guilty pleas and extract information. And once someone had a drug conviction, they could be legally discriminated against in employment, housing, and voting, effectively recreating many of the conditions of Jim Crow through the criminal justice system. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is documented, researched, and increasingly acknowledged even by law enforcement officials. The system was designed to work this way, and it worked exactly as intended for decades. Now, let's talk about the international consequences, because American cannabis prohibition didn't just destroy lives in the United States. It exported that destruction worldwide, particularly to Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean. According to historians studying drug policy, U.S. pressure to ban cannabis globally created black markets in countries that had never had significant cannabis-related problems before prohibition. And once those black markets emerged, they attracted organized crime, which used violence to control territory and supply chains. Governments responded with militarized enforcement, which escalated the violence further, and the spiral continued, creating drug wars that have killed hundreds of thousands of people, displaced millions, and destabilized entire regions. Mexico is the most obvious example. According to estimates from Mexican and international human rights organizations, the drug war in Mexico, which escalated dramatically after the U.S. pushed for more aggressive enforcement in the 1970s and again in the 2000s, has resulted in over 350,000 deaths and tens of thousands of disappearances since 2006 alone. And while cannabis isn't the only drug involved, it was historically one of the primary commodities trafficked from Mexico to the United States. And prohibition is what made that trafficking profitable and violent. Picture this. You're a farmer in rural Mexico in the 1970s. You've been growing corn and beans for generations, barely scraping by. The soil is poor, the market prices are low, and you can't compete with subsidized American agricultural imports. Then someone offers you 10 times what you'd make from corn if you grow cannabis instead. It's illegal, yes, but it's not like the government cares about you anyway. You're already poor, already marginalized, already invisible to authorities, unless they want to harass you. So you grow the cannabis, you sell it to a middleman, and suddenly you can feed your family, send your kids to school, maybe even save a little money. But here's the problem. Because cannabis is illegal, the entire supply chain operates outside legal structures. There are no contracts, no courts to settle disputes, no regulatory oversight. Disagreements are settled with violence. Competing traffickers fight for territory. Corrupt officials demand bribes. And if you get caught, the penalties are severe, years in prison or worse. So, the violence escalates. The cartels consolidate power, and entire regions become war zones, all because American drug policy created a black market for a plant that millions of Americans use recreationally without a second thought. And it's not just Mexico. Colombia, Afghanistan, Morocco, Jamaica, every region that grows cannabis for export has experienced similar dynamics. Prohibition creates illegal markets. Illegal markets attract organized crime. Organized crime brings violence and corruption, and local populations bear the cost. According to the International Drug Policy Consortium, drug prohibition policies largely driven by U.S. pressure, have resulted in human rights abuses across the global South, including extrajudicial killings, mass incarceration, forced eradication programs that destroy farmers' livelihoods, and militarization of law enforcement that makes entire populations less safe, not more. But here's what really gets me. All of this suffering, all of these deaths, all of this destabilization was in service of a policy that didn't even work. Cannabis use didn't decline because of prohibition. It increased dramatically, particularly in the United States, where the drug war was most aggressively prosecuted. According to survey data from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, cannabis use among American adults increased fairly steadily throughout the drug war era. In 1969, roughly 4% of American adults reported having used cannabis. By 2019, that number was over 45%, and among young people, the demographic supposedly most at risk, cannabis use rates fluctuated but generally remained stable, or increased during periods of intense prohibition enforcement. The drug war didn't reduce drug use. It just made drug users criminals. And here's the economic cost. According to the Drug Policy Alliance and other research organizations, the United States has spent over $1 trillion on drug enforcement since 1971, when Nixon officially launched the war on drugs. $1 trillion. That's money that could have gone to education, healthcare, infrastructure, poverty reduction, or literally anything else that might actually improve people's lives. Instead, it went to arresting, prosecuting, and incarcerating millions of people for using a plant that's arguably safer than alcohol or tobacco, both of which remained legal and socially acceptable throughout this entire period. Let's talk about the medical consequences, because this is where prohibition's costs become almost incomprehensible. By banning cannabis and classifying it as a Schedule I drug with no accepted medical use, the U.S. government effectively shut down medical research for decades. According to medical historians and researchers, cannabis research in the United States became nearly impossible after the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970. Any scientist who wanted to study cannabis had to navigate a bureaucratic maze involving the DEA, the FDA, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which controlled the only legal supply of cannabis for research and had an explicit mandate to focus on the harms of drugs, not potential benefits. Studies that might show cannabis had medical value were systematically discouraged, defunded, or blocked entirely, and this happened despite mounting evidence, much of it from other countries where research was less restricted, that cannabis had legitimate therapeutic applications. In the 1970s and 1980s, studies in Israel, the UK, and other countries demonstrated that cannabis could reduce intraocular pressure in glaucoma patients, reduce nausea, and increase appetite in cancer and AIDS patients undergoing chemotherapy, reduce muscle spasms in multiple sclerosis patients, and provide pain relief for chronic conditions that didn't respond well to traditional medications. But because of the prohibition, American patients couldn't access these treatments legally. According to patient advocacy groups, thousands of people suffered needlessly, enduring pain, nausea, wasting, and other debilitating symptoms that cannabis might have alleviated, all because the government decided that cannabis had no medical value and maintained that fiction for decades, despite accumulating evidence to the contrary. There are documented cases, heartbreaking cases, of cancer patients who turned to black market cannabis to manage chemotherapy side effects and were arrested for it, of epileptic children whose seizures were dramatically reduced by cannabis oil, but whose parents faced prosecution for obtaining it, of chronic pain patients who found relief with cannabis but were forced back onto dangerous opioids because those were legal and cannabis wasn't. And here's the ultimate irony. While the US government was insisting cannabis had no medical value, that same government held patents on cannabinoids as neuroprotectants and antioxidants. Patent number 6,630-5107, awarded to the US Department of Health and Human Services in 2003, specifically covers the use of cannabinoids for treating neurological diseases and damage. So the government was simultaneously claiming cannabis had no medical value and patenting its medical applications. You literally can't make this stuff up. Now, let's talk about the social and cultural costs. Because prohibition didn't just destroy individual lives and fuel international violence, it also poisoned public discourse and made it nearly impossible to have honest conversations about drugs, risk, and personal freedom. According to media researchers and public health experts, decades of anti-drug propaganda, much of it funded by government agencies with a vested interest in maintaining prohibition, created a culture of misinformation and fear that's still affecting policy decisions today. Entire generations of Americans grew up hearing that marijuana was a gateway drug, that it caused brain damage, that it led inevitably to harder drugs and ruined lives. And while some of that propaganda has been debunked, the residual fear and stigma remain. This matters because it affects how we approach drug education, treatment, and policy. Instead of teaching young people honest, evidence-based information about drug risks and harm reduction, we taught them lies like one marijuana cigarette is as harmful as 5 tobacco cigarettes, or marijuana makes you permanently stupid. And when kids inevitably discovered these claims were false, either through personal experience or basic research, it undermined all drug education, including legitimate warnings about actually dangerous substances. And prohibition also created a massive opportunity cost in terms of what we didn't learn and didn't accomplish because we were so focused on punishment rather than understanding. According to researchers at universities that were finally able to study cannabis once some states began legalizing it, we're only now beginning to understand the plant's full pharmacological profile, how different cannabinoids interact with the body's endocannabinoid system, and what therapeutic applications might be possible. That research could have started 50 years ago. We could have developed refined, standardized medical cannabis products decades earlier. We could have prevented suffering, but we didn't, because prohibition made the research essentially impossible. So why did governments ban smoking weed? We've established the reasons: racism, economic interests, bureaucratic self-preservation, and control. But now we know the costs. Millions of lives destroyed by arrest and incarceration, hundreds of thousands of deaths from drug war violence, trillions of dollars wasted, medical research stalled for decades, and entire communities traumatized by aggressive enforcement of a policy that was founded on lies from the very beginning. And perhaps the most enraging part, the people who designed and implemented this system, Anslinger, Nixon, and countless others, faced no consequences for the destruction they caused. They lived comfortable lives, retired with pensions, and were often praised as tough-on-crime leaders. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people, disproportionately black and brown, poor and marginalized, paid the price for their ambitions and prejudices. But here's the thing, the story doesn't end there. Because despite everything, despite decades of propaganda and criminalization and violence, cannabis prohibition is finally, slowly beginning to crumble. And the way that's happening, the movements that made it possible, and the lessons we can learn from it, that's where things get hopeful again. Because people fought back, and eventually, they started winning. How did smoking weed become cool again? Let's dive into this. Because after decades of demonization, after millions of arrests, after $1 trillion spent trying to eradicate a plant, something unexpected happened. Cannabis went from being the most vilified drug in America to being legal in dozens of states, accepted by mainstream culture, and even celebrated as a wellness product you could buy at the same strip mall as your yoga studio. So how did that happen? How did weed go from just say no to artisanal pre-rolls with terpene profiles? Here's the thing. Cannabis didn't become cool again because the government suddenly admitted they'd been lying for 80 years. It didn't happen because politicians woke up one day and decided prohibition was unjust. It happened because ordinary people, patients, activists, libertarians, and even some conservatives built a movement that was impossible to ignore. And that movement succeeded not by asking permission, but by creating facts on the ground that made prohibition increasingly absurd and unsustainable. Let's start in the 1970s, because while Nixon was launching the modern war on drugs and ramping up cannabis arrests, something else was happening that would eventually undermine the entire prohibition regime. People were organizing. According to historians of drug policy reform, the modern cannabis legalization movement began not with hippies smoking in parks, but with two distinct groups who had very different motivations, but ended up as unlikely allies: medical patients who needed cannabis to manage serious health conditions, and libertarians who objected to government control over personal behavior. The medical side of the story is particularly important because it gave the movement moral authority that was hard to dismiss. In the 1970s, as cancer treatment improved and more patients survived chemotherapy, doctors began noticing a serious problem. The nausea and appetite suppression caused by chemotherapy were so severe that some patients literally starved to death or became too weak to continue treatment. And some of these patients, desperate for relief, discovered that smoking cannabis dramatically reduced their nausea and stimulated their appetite enough to eat and maintain their strength. One of the most famous early cases involved a young man named Robert Randall, who in 1976 became the first American to receive legal cannabis from the federal government for medical purposes. Randall had glaucoma, a condition that causes increased pressure in the eye and can lead to blindness. He discovered that smoking cannabis reduced his eye pressure more effectively than any prescription medication available at the time. But because cannabis was illegal, he was arrested for cultivation. Rather than accept a plea deal, Randall fought the charges, arguing medical necessity, that he needed cannabis to preserve his vision, and that no legal alternative was as effective. And in a shocking decision, he won. The court ruled that his medical need outweighed the federal prohibition, and the federal government was forced to create a program to supply him with cannabis legally. This led to the Compassionate investigational new drug program, which at its peak in the early 1990s supplied cannabis to about a dozen patients with serious medical conditions. The program was tiny, bureaucratic, and hedged with restrictions, but it established a crucial precedent. The federal government itself was admitting, through its actions if not its rhetoric, that cannabis had legitimate medical value. But here's where the movement really gained momentum. In the 1980s and early 1990s, as the AIDS epidemic devastated communities, particularly gay men in urban areas, thousands of patients discovered that cannabis was one of the few things that could manage the wasting syndrome, nausea, and appetite loss that killed many AIDS patients before the disease itself did. According to oral histories from AIDS activists, cannabis became a kind of underground medicine in the gay community, passed from patient to patient, often grown by volunteers who risked arrest to help dying friends. And because the Reagan administration was criminally negligent in its response to AIDS, refusing to fund research or treatment adequately, and essentially letting an entire generation die, the gay community had no faith in government authority and no patience for laws that prevented them from accessing medicine that worked. This created a powerful coalition. AIDS activists, who were already confrontational and media savvy from fighting government indifference, joined forces with cancer patients, glaucoma patients, and others who needed medical cannabis. And together, they started pushing for state-level medical marijuana laws. Now, at the same time, a completely different movement was building. Libertarians and drug policy reformers, people who objected to prohibition on principle rather than out of medical necessity, were also organizing. Think tanks like the Drug Policy Alliance, founded in 1986, and the Marijuana Policy Project, founded in 1995, began producing research, lobbying politicians, and building networks of activists who believed that cannabis prohibition was unjust, ineffective, and a waste of resources. According to the founders of these organizations, their strategy was deliberately pragmatic. They didn't lead with cannabis should be legal because freedom or the drug war is racist, even though both statements were true. Instead, they led with harm reduction and medical access, arguments that were harder to dismiss and that appealed to moderates and even some conservatives who were uncomfortable with government overreach. And this strategy worked. In 1996, California voters passed Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act, making California the first state to legalize medical cannabis. It wasn't even close. The initiative passed with 56% of the vote, despite fierce opposition from law enforcement, the federal government, and the pharmaceutical industry. Picture this. You're a California voter in 1996. You've spent your whole life hearing that marijuana is dangerous, a gateway drug, something only criminals and losers use. But then you see campaign ads featuring cancer patients, grandmothers with glaucoma, AIDS patients wasting away, all saying the same thing. Cannabis helps, nothing else works as well, and the government is letting us suffer for no good reason. And you think, wait, we're arresting cancer patients. And suddenly, prohibition doesn't seem like it's about public health. It seems cruel. That shift in perception was crucial. Medical marijuana laws gave millions of Americans personal exposure to cannabis users who were sympathetic, responsible, and using the plant to manage genuine medical conditions. It became much harder to maintain the reefer madness narrative. When your neighbor with MS was using cannabis, to stop her muscle spasms, or when your uncle with cancer credited it with helping him survive chemo. And once California legalized medical cannabis, the floodgates opened. Arizona passed a medical marijuana law in 1996, though it was later overturned on a technicality and repassed in 2010. Oregon, Washington, and Maine followed in 1998 and 1999, and the trend continued through the 2000s and 2010s, with state after state passing medical marijuana laws despite continued federal prohibition and threats from the DEA. But here's what really changed the game. Medical marijuana laws weren't just about helping patients. They also normalized cannabis use in a way that made full legalization politically feasible. Because once you have legal dispensaries operating openly, once cannabis becomes a regulated industry with tax revenue and jobs, once millions of people are using it legally for medical purposes, the distinction between medical and recreational starts to seem arbitrary. According to polling data from organizations like Gallup and Pew Research, American attitudes toward cannabis shifted dramatically between 2000 and 2020. In 2000, only about 30% of Americans supported legalization. By 2020, that number was over 65%, including majorities of Republicans, Democrats, and independents. That's not a normal pace of social change. That's a generational shift happening in real time. And here's where the cultural dimension becomes important. Because it wasn't just policy advocacy and medical necessity driving this change. Popular culture was also shifting. Cannabis was shedding its dangerous drug image and picking up new associations. Wellness, creativity, relaxation, and a safer alternative to alcohol. Part of this was generational. By the 2000s, millions of baby boomers and Gen Xers who had smoked cannabis in their youth without becoming heroin addicts or losing their minds were now voting, working respectable jobs, and raising families. They knew from personal experience that the government had been lying about cannabis, and they were less willing to support policies that contradicted their lived reality. But it was also driven by entrepreneurs and marketers who saw an opportunity. As medical marijuana laws created legal-ish markets, a whole cannabis industry emerged, complete with branding, product development, and sophisticated marketing. Cannabis wasn't just weed anymore. It was medicine, it was wellness, it was lifestyle. Dispensaries started looking like Apple stores. Products came with lab testing, terpene profiles, and strain names that sounded like craft beers. And the people selling it weren't shady dealers in hoodies. They were bud tenders with product knowledge and customer service training. This rebranding mattered because it made cannabis accessible to demographics that would never have bought it from a street dealer. Suburban moms started using cannabis gummies for anxiety. Middle-aged professionals tried CBD for chronic pain. Older adults discovered that cannabis helped them sleep better than Ambien. And once these respectable demographics started using cannabis openly, without shame or secrecy, the stigma began to crumble. According to market research, the demographics of cannabis users diversified dramatically as legalization spread. It wasn't just young men anymore. Women became one of the fastest growing consumer segments. Seniors started using cannabis products for arthritis and insomnia. Even some law enforcement officials and conservative politicians, people who had spent their careers supporting prohibition, quietly admitted they'd change their minds, often because of personal experience with a family member who benefited from medical cannabis. And then came 2012, the year that changed everything. Colorado and Washington became the first states to legalize cannabis for recreational use, not just medical. And unlike medical marijuana laws, which the federal government could kind of tolerate by pretending they were about compassion and medicine, recreational legalization was a direct challenge to federal prohibition. States were explicitly saying, "We don't care what the federal government says. Cannabis is legal here. Deal with it." And you know what happened? The sky didn't fall. Crime didn't spike. Teenagers didn't start using cannabis at dramatically higher rates. In fact, most of the dire predictions from prohibitionists simply didn't come true. Colorado and Washington established regulated markets, collected millions in tax revenue, and proved that legalization could work without social chaos. That success gave other states confidence to follow. Alaska and Oregon legalized in 2014. California, Massachusetts, Maine, and Nevada in 2016. And the dominoes kept falling. Michigan, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, Virginia. By 2024, recreational cannabis would be legal in nearly half of U.S. states, covering a majority of the American population. But it wasn't just happening in the United States. Uruguay legalized cannabis nationally in 2013. Canada followed in 2018, becoming the first major Western nation to fully legalize at the federal level. And countries across Europe, Latin America, and other regions began relaxing their laws, moving toward decriminalization or medical access programs. The prohibitionist consensus that had held for 80 years was collapsing, not because governments suddenly became enlightened, but because ordinary people refused to accept the lies anymore. And that's not even the most interesting part, because part two, that's when we talk about what happened after legalization, how cannabis went from being merely legal to being mainstream, commercialized, and even gentrified. And that story is complicated in ways that should make us think carefully about what we've won, what we've lost, and what comes next. So, where do we begin? Cannabis is legal in roughly half of U.S. states. Dispensaries are operating openly. Celebrities are launching weed brands, and you can buy CBD products at your local CVS. The drug war, at least when it comes to cannabis, seems to be winding down. Victory, right? Well, yes and no. Because what's happened in the wake of legalization is far more complicated than we won, prohibition is over, everyone's happy now. Let's talk about what legalization actually looks like on the ground. Because it's both better and worse than advocates expected. Better in that millions of people no longer face arrest for cannabis possession. Worse in that the legal cannabis industry has, in many ways, reproduced the same inequalities and injustices that prohibition created in the first place. According to data from states that have legalized cannabis, arrests for possession have dropped dramatically, which is obviously good. In Colorado, cannabis arrests fell by over 90% in the years following legalization. Similar patterns emerged in Washington, Oregon, and other early legalizing states. And that means hundreds of thousands of people who would have been arrested, jailed, and given criminal records under prohibition are instead living their lives freely. That's a genuine win, and we shouldn't minimize it. But here's the problem. While arrests have decreased overall, racial disparities in enforcement haven't disappeared. Even in states with legal cannabis, Black people are still arrested at higher rates than white people for cannabis-related offenses, particularly for things like public consumption, driving under the influence, or selling without a license. According to the ACLU's analysis of post-legalization arrest data, the racial gap has narrowed but not closed, which means that even when we fix the law, systemic racism in enforcement continues. And then there's the question of who actually benefits from legalization economically. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: the legal cannabis industry is overwhelmingly white and male, even though black and brown communities bore the brunt of prohibition enforcement for decades. According to industry surveys, roughly 80% of cannabis business owners are white, and around 70% are male. In Colorado, one of the first states to legalize, less than 2% of cannabis business licenses are held by black people, even though black Coloradans make up about 4% of the state's population and were arrested for cannabis offenses at rates far higher than white residents during Prohibition. Why the disparity? Partly, it's about capital. Opening a legal cannabis business requires significant upfront investment, often hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars, for licensing, real estate, security, inventory, and compliance. And because cannabis is still federally illegal, most banks won't work with cannabis businesses, which means you can't get traditional business loans. You need cash, lots of it, up front, and communities that were systematically impoverished by decades of drug war enforcement don't have that kind of capital sitting around. But it's also about barriers to entry. Many states require background checks for cannabis license applicants and automatically disqualify anyone with a prior drug conviction. Read that again. The people most harmed by cannabis prohibition, the ones who were arrested and criminalized for doing exactly what is now legal and profitable, are banned from participating in the legal industry. It's almost perfect in its cruelty. According to activists and researchers studying cannabis equity, this has created a deeply unjust situation where white entrepreneurs, many of whom broke the same laws without getting caught, are now making millions in the legal cannabis industry, while black and brown individuals who were arrested for the same behavior are locked out, often literally because they're still in prison or on parole. Some states have tried to address this through social equity programs that give preference or support to license applicants from communities disproportionately harmed by prohibition. Illinois, Massachusetts, and California have all implemented versions of these programs, but according to evaluations, they've had limited success. The programs are often underfunded, bureaucratically complex, and insufficient to overcome the structural barriers that keep marginalized communities out of the legal market. And here's another twist. Legalization hasn't eliminated the illicit market. According to estimates, a substantial portion of cannabis in legal states still comes from unlicensed sources. Why? Legal cannabis is expensive, often significantly more expensive than black market products, due to taxes, regulatory costs, and the overhead of running a legal business. For price-sensitive consumers, particularly in low-income communities, the black market remains attractive, and when people get caught selling or growing cannabis outside the legal system, even in states where cannabis is technically legal, they still face criminal penalties, sometimes harsh ones. California, for example, has imposed tough penalties on unlicensed cannabis operations, arguing that they're necessary to protect the legal market and ensure product safety. But the result is that people, again disproportionately black and brown, are still being arrested and imprisoned for cannabis in a supposedly legal state, just under different legal frameworks. So, legalization has created a two-tiered system: a legal, heavily regulated, expensive, and predominantly white industry on one side, and a continuing illicit market on the other that's still subject to criminal enforcement, targeting the same communities that prohibition always targeted. Now, let's talk about the commercialization and corporate takeover of cannabis, because this is where weed became cool again, starts to feel more like weed became another capitalist commodity, for better and worse. According to industry analysts, the legal cannabis market in the United States was worth roughly $25 billion in 2023, and it's projected to grow significantly as more states legalize and the federal government potentially reschedules or legalizes cannabis nationally. That's a lot of money, and where there's money, there are corporations. Major companies, including alcohol and tobacco corporations, have invested heavily in cannabis. Constellation Brands, which owns Corona Beer, invested $4 billion in Canopy Growth, a Canadian cannabis company. Altria, which makes Marlboro cigarettes, invested nearly $2 billion in Kronos Group, and countless venture capital firms, private equity companies, and pharmaceutical corporations are positioning themselves to dominate the industry once federal legalization happens. This has activists worried, and for good reason. According to drug policy reformers, corporate consolidation could lead to a cannabis industry that looks a lot like big tobacco or big alcohol, dominated by a few massive companies focused on maximizing profits rather than public health, and aggressively marketing addictive products to vulnerable populations, the very things legalization was supposed to avoid. And there are already signs this is happening. Cannabis marketing has become incredibly sophisticated, with brands targeting specific demographics, celebrity endorsements, lifestyle branding, and product innovations designed to appeal to new consumers. Some of this is fine. Adults should be able to make informed choices about cannabis consumption, but there's a fine line between providing information and manipulating behavior, and some companies are clearly crossing it. According to public health researchers, there's particular concern about high-potency products like dabs, vape cartridges with 80-90% THC, and edibles with extremely high doses. These products are far more potent than the cannabis flower people smoked in the 1960s or even the 1990s. And while most adults can use them responsibly, there's growing evidence that very high-potency products, used frequently, can increase the risk of cannabis use disorder, anxiety, and in some cases, psychosis, particularly in young people whose brains are still developing. This doesn't mean cannabis is as dangerous as prohibitionists claimed. It's not. But it does mean that legalization, particularly legalization that prioritizes profit over public health, comes with risks that need to be managed thoughtfully. And right now, it's not clear that's happening. But here's where things get genuinely interesting, and maybe even optimistic. Despite all these problems, the corporate takeover, the racial inequities, the regulatory failures, cannabis legalization has still achieved something remarkable. It has normalized conversations about drug policy in a way that seemed impossible 20 years ago. According to polling and public discourse analysis, cannabis legalization has opened the door to broader conversations about criminal justice reform, addiction treatment, and the failures of the drug war. Politicians who once supported harsh drug penalties are now advocating for sentencing, reform, and expungement of cannabis convictions. Mainstream media outlets that once uncritically repeated government propaganda about drugs are now publishing investigative pieces about the harms of prohibition, and perhaps most importantly, millions of people who never would have questioned drug policy before have had their eyes opened by the cannabis legalization movement. They've seen how propaganda works, how institutions lie to protect their interests, and how change is possible when ordinary people organize and refuse to accept injustice. That's not a small thing. The cannabis legalization movement didn't just change laws about one plant. It changed how an entire generation thinks about authority, evidence, and whose interests laws actually serve. And there's also been a genuine revival of interest in cannabis's historical and cultural significance. People are rediscovering that this isn't just a drug that hippies used in the 1960s. It's a plant that's been part of human civilization for thousands of years, used for medicine, ritual, creativity, and community across cultures and continents. That knowledge, that sense of connection to a deeper human story, is part of what makes cannabis cool again, in a way that's more meaningful than just trendy branding. According to anthropologists and ethnobotanists, there's been a surge of interest in traditional cannabis cultivation, landrace strains, and the cultural contexts in which cannabis was historically used. People want to know where the plant came from, how it spread, what it meant to the Scythians, or the Indian Sadhus, or the Rastafarians. There's a hunger for authenticity, for connection to something older and more meaningful than just getting high. And in some ways, that's bringing us full circle. Because the cannabis story we've traced over these hours, from ancient Central Asian tombs to modern American dispensaries, is ultimately a story about human nature, about our desire to alter consciousness, to ease suffering, to connect with something transcendent, and about how those desires can be honored or exploited or criminalized, depending on who holds power and whose interests are being served. So did weed become cool again? Yes, in the sense that it's no longer stigmatized the way it was during the height of Prohibition. Yes, in the sense that it's been rebranded as a wellness product and a lifestyle choice rather than a criminal vice. And yes, in the sense that millions of people who once accepted Prohibition propaganda have changed their minds and embraced cannabis as relatively harmless and potentially beneficial. But it's also true that legalization is incomplete, uneven, and in many ways compromised. The drug war hasn't ended. It's just shifted focus. People are still being arrested, still being imprisoned, still having their lives destroyed over a plant. And the benefits of legalization have been distributed unequally, with the communities most harmed by Prohibition often locked out of the legal industry. So the real question isn't whether weed is cool again. It's what we do with this moment. Do we settle for half measures, where some people can buy legal cannabis while others are still in prison for it? Do we allow corporations to dominate the industry and prioritize profits over public health and justice? Or do we push for something better, real equity, real expungement of past convictions, real reinvestment in communities harmed by the drug war, and thoughtful regulations that protect public health without recreating Prohibition's harms? Those questions don't have easy answers. But the cannabis legalization movement has already proven that change is possible that decades of entrenched policy can be overturned when enough people refuse to accept injustice, and that sometimes the coolest thing you can do is tell the truth, even when powerful institutions have spent billions of dollars trying to bury it. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Cannabis didn't become cool again because of clever marketing or celebrity endorsements or slick dispensary branding. It became acceptable again because people, ordinary people, patients, activists, researchers, voters, refused to believe the lies. They looked at the evidence, trusted their own experiences, and demanded better. And eventually, against enormous opposition, they won. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to prove that change is possible, even on issues where the government has lied for generations. And if we can do that for cannabis, what else might we be able to change?